I imagine a forest floor in late spring, where the earth is soft and dark beneath a canopy of leaves, and the air smells faintly of moss and rain that fell sometime in the night. The light here is dappled, filtering down through branches in scattered coins of gold, and in this quiet space, among the rotting logs and scattered pine needles, there exists a world that hums with purpose, though it makes no sound at all. Beneath my feet, invisible to the careless eye, entire civilizations rise and fall. They move through tunnels carved in darkness, through chambers built with nothing but mandibles and time, and they have been doing this in one form or another for more than 100 million years. I am watching an ant colony, not from above, not as an outsider peering down with detachment, but as someone who has learned to see the forest differently, to notice the thin trails that weave between blades of grass, the steady procession of workers carrying fragments of leaf and seed, the almost imperceptible organization that governs every movement, every decision, every life. There is something hypnotic about this, the way a single ant emerges from a crack in the bark, pauses, touches the surface with her antennae, and then moves forward with absolute certainty. She is not wandering. She is not lost. She is part of a conversation that has no words, a chemical language written in the air, in the soil, on every surface she touches. I have come to understand that what I am witnessing is not chaos, though it may appear that way at first. It is not randomness. It is a kind of distributed intelligence, a mind without a brain, a purpose without a plan. And the more I watch, the more I find myself drawn into the rhythm of it, the patient unfolding of tasks that have been carried out in nearly the same way since before the continents took their current shape. The colony I am observing is home to thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of individuals, though I cannot see most of them. They are below ground, in a labyrinth of tunnels that extends far deeper than I might guess, spiraling down through layers of clay and root systems, past the reach of daylight, into a coolness that remains constant even when the surface bakes under summer sun. Some of those ants are tending to eggs, pale and translucent, arranged in neat clusters, while others are feeding larvae that writhe slowly in their nursery chambers. Still others are excavating new tunnels, carrying grains of soil to the surface one by one, depositing them in a growing mound that marks the entrance to their world. And at the center of it all, deep in the darkness where no light has ever reached, there is a queen, larger than her daughters, her abdomen swollen with eggs. She does not command. She does not direct. She simply exists, producing the next generation, while around her the colony organizes itself according to rules that no single ant understands. This is what fascinates me, the emergent order, the way complexity arises from simplicity, the way thousands of small decisions, each made by an individual with a brain smaller than a grain of sand, can add up to something that looks almost like thought, almost like strategy, almost like art. I have been standing here longer than I intended, watching the light shift, watching the shadows lengthen, and I find that time moves differently when I am paying attention to the scale of life. Minutes stretch, hours compress. The urgency of the human world seems distant, irrelevant, replaced by the steady pulse of foraging, building, tending, surviving. There is no narrative here in the way I am accustomed to stories, No rising action or climax or resolution, only the endless repetition of necessary work, the maintenance of order against entropy, the continuation of a lineage that predates flowers, predates grass, predates almost everything I take for granted in this forest. And yet, there is something deeply compelling about it, something that draws me back again and again, to kneel in the dirt, to watch the trails form and dissolve, to trace the paths of individuals as they navigate a landscape of scent and texture that I can barely imagine. I think about the weight of history contained in these small bodies, the evolutionary experiments that led to this moment, the countless generations that refined these behaviors, these structures, these silent forms of cooperation, and I find myself wanting to know more, to understand how this began, how it changed, how it became what I am witnessing now. So I settle into the grass, careful not to disturb the trails, and I begin to trace the story backward, into deep time, into the origins of something so familiar and yet so strange, into the long history of the ant colony. The story begins long before forests looked the way they do now, long before the trees that tower above me even existed as a possibility, back in a time when the world was configured differently, when the air itself had a different composition, when the very idea of a flower had not yet occurred to evolution. Ants emerged sometime during the Cretaceous period, roughly 140 million years ago, though the exact moment is lost to time, buried in sediment and speculation. What we know comes from fossils, from amber, from the preserved bodies of creatures caught mid-step and held there for epochs, their forms frozen in golden resin, waiting to tell us something about how this all began. The ancestors of ants were wasps, solitary hunters that lived alone, that built no colonies, that knew nothing of cooperation or shared labor. They were predators, sleek and independent, moving through an ancient landscape in search of prey, and they would have remained that way, solitary and unchanged, if not for a series of shifts that we can only partly reconstruct. Something changed gradually over millions of years. Some of these wasps began to stay near their nests, to guard their young rather than abandoning them, to overlap generations in a way that was unusual, revolutionary even. Mothers and daughters occupied the same space, shared the same resources, and slowly, almost accidentally, they began to divide the work. This is how eusociality begins, not with a grand plan, not with sudden innovation, but with small adjustments that accumulate, that become habits, that eventually become hardwired into biology. A daughter who stays to help her mother raise more sisters, who forgoes her own reproduction to assist the colony, who becomes a worker rather than a queen. The earliest ants appeared in a world that would seem alien to us now. The continents were still joined in places we cannot imagine. Pangaea had long since fractured, but the pieces were still drifting, still finding their positions, and the climate was warmer, more humid, with vast stretches of coniferous forest and low-lying vegetation that has since vanished from the earth. In this world, these proto-ants were small, unremarkable. They lived in the leaf litter, in rotting wood, in the soil, competing with other insects for space and sustenance. They had not yet diversified into the thousands of forms we see today, had not yet invented agriculture or slavery, or the complex chemical communication systems that would come later. They were humble, tentative testing the possibilities of collective life, but they had something, some advantage that allowed them to persist, to spread, to begin the long process of adaptation that would eventually make them one of the most successful groups of organisms on the planet. Perhaps it was their social structure, the ability to defend resources collectively, to overwhelm prey through numbers, to survive losses that would doom a solitary insect. I imagine one of these early colonies, nestled in the hollow of a fallen tree, somewhere in what would become South America, or perhaps Australia, the geography uncertain, the landscape unrecognizable. A queen, not so different from the wasps she descended from, tending a small cluster of larvae, while her first daughters, newly emerged, begin to explore the world beyond the nest. They are cautious. These first workers, moving slowly through the debris, their antennae constantly sampling the air, searching for the chemical signatures of food, of danger, of each other. They communicate through touch, through pheromones that evaporate quickly in the humid air, and they are learning individually and collectively what works, what doesn't, what keeps the colony alive. The colony is fragile at this stage. A heavy rain could flood the nest. A predator could devastate the population in minutes. Disease could spread unchecked through the confined space. And yet, it persists. The workers forage, bringing back fragments of dead insects, seeds, anything that might sustain the growing larvae. And the queen continues to lay eggs, expanding the colony one individual at a time. This pattern repeats across the ancient world in countless locations, countless species branching and diverging, experimenting with different strategies, different body plans, different ways of organizing collective life. Some ants remain generalists, eating whatever they can find, while others begin to specialize, to focus on particular food sources, particular niches in the ecosystem. By 100 million years ago, ants had begun to diversify in earnest. The fossil record shows us glimpses of this radiation, specimens preserved in amber from what is now Myanmar, their bodies so well preserved that we can see the fine hairs on their legs, the structure of their antennae, the proportions that mark them as belonging to lineages that still exist today. These ancient ants were already successful, already widespread, but they had not yet achieved dominance. They were outnumbered by termites, by other social insects, by the vast armies of solitary beetles and flies that filled every available niche. The world was crowded, competitive, and ants were simply one group among many, trying to survive, trying to expand. And then something happened, something that would change everything, not just for ants, but for the entire structure of terrestrial ecosystems. The flowering plants appeared, angiosperms, arriving roughly 130 million years ago, spreading slowly at first, then explosively, transforming landscapes, creating new opportunities, new resources, new relationships. Flowers produced nectar, fruits, seeds with rich nutrients, and they required pollinators, dispersers, partners in reproduction. And ants, already social, already organized, already moving through the leaf litter and the understory, were perfectly positioned to exploit these new niches. Some ants became seed dispersers, carrying seeds back to their nests, eating the nutritious attachments, and discarding the seeds in underground chambers where they could germinate safely, protected from predators, planted in soil enriched by the colony's waste. This relationship benefited both parties. The plants gained dispersal, the ants gained food, and a new form of mutualism was born. Other ants began to tend aphids, scale insects, tiny sapsuckers that produced honeydew, a sugary secretion that ants found irresistible. The ants would protect these insects from predators, move them to fresh feeding sites, even carry them into the nest during harsh weather, essentially domesticating them, farming them, millions of years before humans would conceive of agriculture. And some ants went further still. They began to cultivate fungus. This happened independently in several lineages, but the most famous example, the leafcutter ants, emerged sometime around 50 to 60 million years ago in the forests of South America. These ants did not eat the leaves they cut. Instead, they carried them underground, chewed them into pulp, and used them as substrate for growing fungus. The fungus broke down the plant material, and the ants fed on the fungal growth, creating a three-way symbiosis between ant, plant, and fungus that continues to this day. This was agriculture, true agriculture, long before humans, and it required extraordinary coordination. Workers had to cut the leaves, others had to carry them, others had to prepare the substrate, tend the gardens, remove contaminated material, defend against parasitic fungi that could destroy the crop. The colony became a superorganism, each individual a cell in a larger body, performing specialized functions, unable to survive alone. I think about the time scales involved, the millions of years of refinement, the countless colonies that failed, the innovations that succeeded and spread, the gradual accumulation of behaviors and structures that transformed simple cooperation into something far more complex, far more resilient. By 50 million years ago, ants had become a dominant force in terrestrial ecosystems. They were everywhere, in every climate zone, every habitat, from the canopy to the soil, from the tropics to the temperate forests. Their biomass rivaled that of all vertebrates combined, and their ecological impact was profound. They moved soil, dispersed seeds, recycled nutrients, controlled populations of other insects, shaped the very structure of the communities they inhabited. And yet, each colony still began the same way, with a single queen, freshly mated, searching for a place to dig, to lay her first eggs, to start the cycle again. The grand evolutionary narrative, the million-year arc of diversification and adaptation, compressed into the tiny struggle of one individual, trying to survive long enough to create workers, to establish a foothold, to become, perhaps, the foundation of a colony that would outlive her by decades. This is the paradox at the heart of ant societies. They are ancient, enduring, yet each colony is temporary, mortal, built from scratch with every generation. The knowledge is not passed down through teaching, not preserved in books or stories, but encoded in genes, in instincts, in chemical signals that trigger behaviors refined over deep time. I watch the ants moving past my feet, and I see in them this entire history, this long experiment in collective life, these millions of years compressed into the simple act of carrying a seed, of touching antennae with a nest mate, of following a trail laid down moments ago by a sister who has already moved on, searching, always searching, for what the colony needs to survive another day, another season, another generation. The colony I am watching now in this present moment, in this temperate forest floor, is perhaps 5 years old, though I cannot know for certain. The queen who founded it flew on a warm day in late spring, rose into the air with thousands of other virgin queens and males, all emerging simultaneously from colonies across the region, all responding to the same atmospheric cues, the same combination of temperature and humidity and light that triggers the nuptial flight. She mated in the air, or perhaps on a leaf or a branch, storing the sperm of one or more males in a specialized organ called a spermatheca, enough genetic material to fertilize millions of eggs over the course of her lifetime. The males, their purpose fulfilled, died within hours, while she descended, her wings now a burden, and tore them off, leaving ragged stubs, marks of her transformation from reproductive to foundress. She dug, using her mandibles and legs, excavating a small chamber in the soft earth, perhaps beneath a stone, perhaps in the shelter of a root, sealing herself inside, alone in the darkness, and began to lay eggs. Her body metabolized her now useless wing muscles, converting them into energy, into nutrition for the first larvae. She did not eat, did not leave the chamber, simply waited, tending her brood, keeping them clean, rotating them to prevent fungal growth. Those first workers emerged small, underfed, produced from a mother who was slowly consuming herself to create them. But they were enough. They broke through the seal, ventured into the world, began to forage, and suddenly the queen had help, had resources flowing back into the nest, had daughters who could do the work she could no longer manage alone. The colony grew slowly at first, a few dozen workers, then a few hundred, each new generation larger, better fed, more capable. The workers expanded the nest, digging new tunnels, creating chambers for different purposes, a nursery for the brood, storage areas for food, midden chambers for waste. The architecture emerged without blueprint, without plan, each ant following simple rules, responding to local conditions, and somehow, collectively, creating a structure of remarkable sophistication. I have read about studies where researchers made casts of ant nests, pouring molten aluminum or concrete into abandoned colonies, waiting for it to harden, then excavating the resulting sculpture. And what emerges is astonishing. Tunnels that spiral down for meters, chambers arranged with apparent logic, ventilation shafts that regulate temperature and humidity, a three-dimensional maze that no single ant designed, no individual comprehends, but that functions as a coherent whole. The workers I see on the surface, moving along their trails, represent only a fraction of the colony's population. Perhaps 10 or 20% venture outside on any given day, while the rest remain below, performing tasks that are invisible to me, but essential to the colony's survival. Some workers tend the brood, feeding larvae, moving them to chambers with optimal temperature and humidity, grooming them to prevent disease. The larvae are helpless, legless, unable to move or feed themselves, entirely dependent on the care of their older sisters. And the workers are attentive, constant, responding to chemical signals from the larvae that communicate their needs, their developmental stage, their hunger. Other workers process food, taking in liquid nutrition from foragers, storing it in their crops, and distributing it to nest mates through trophallaxis, mouth-to-mouth feeding, A constant sharing of resources that binds the colony together ensures that no individual starves while others are fed, creates a kind of collective stomach, a shared metabolic system. Still others excavate, carrying soil particles to the surface, grain by grain, expanding the nest as the colony grows, or repairing damage when tunnels collapse, when rain floods the chambers, when a predator breaches the walls. They work in darkness, navigating by touch and smell, following chemical markers left by previous excavators, adding to tunnels that may extend far beyond what any individual worker has explored. And there are soldiers in some species, larger workers with oversized heads and powerful mandibles, specialists in defense. They patrol the nest, guard the entrances, respond to alarm pheromones when danger threatens. Their role is to fight, to die if necessary, to sacrifice themselves so that the colony, the queen, the brood can survive. This division of labor is not assigned. There is no manager, no coordinator, no hierarchy beyond the simple fact of the queen's reproductive role. Instead, workers transition between tasks as they age, a phenomenon called temporal polyethism. Young workers stay in the nest, tending brood, while older workers venture outside, where the dangers are greater, where their remaining life expectancy makes their loss less costly to the colony. But even this is not rigid, not fixed. If the colony needs more foragers, nurses will transition early. If brood production increases, older workers will return to tending. The colony is adaptive, responsive, constantly adjusting the allocation of labor based on need, on circumstance, on the collective assessment of what is required. I watch a worker approach the nest entrance, her mandibles gripping a seed nearly as large as her own body. She pauses, touches antennae with a guard, exchanges information through chemicals and contact, and is admitted, disappearing into the darkness. The seed will be stored or processed or planted in a midden where it might germinate and be harvested again, depending on the species, the season, the needs of the moment. Another worker emerges, moves directly to the trail, and begins to follow it, her antennae sweeping side to side, reading the pheromone markers laid down by previous foragers. The trail is a feat of chemical engineering, a scent path that strengthens when successful foragers return, reinforcing productive routes, and fades when resources are depleted, allowing the colony to dynamically allocate effort toward the most rewarding areas. She reaches a branch point where the trail splits, and she hesitates, sampling both paths, comparing the strength of the pheromone signals. She chooses the stronger trail, the one more recently reinforced, and continues, moving with purpose through a landscape of chemical information that I cannot perceive, cannot even imagine. I have learned that ants can distinguish between trails laid by nest mates and those laid by ants from other colonies, even other species. They can detect minute difference in pheromone composition, in ratios of chemical compounds, and respond accordingly, following their own trails, avoiding or attacking foreign scent markers, defending their foraging territory through invisible chemical boundaries. The worker I am following reaches a source of honeydew, a small colony of aphids on the underside of a leaf. She approaches, strokes the aphids gently with her antennae, stimulating them to release droplets of sweet liquid, and she drinks, filling her crop, her social stomach, with nutrition that she will carry back to the nest. share with her sisters, distribute through the colony's network of mouths and stomachs until it has been divided among dozens, perhaps hundreds of individuals. This is how the colony feeds itself, not through individual meals, but through collective accumulation and distribution. No single ant eats enough to survive alone, but together, through constant sharing, they maintain the whole. They are less like individuals and more like cells, components of a larger organism that exists at a scale beyond the body, beyond the individual lifespan, beyond the limits of personal survival. I think about the queen, still below, still laying eggs, perhaps 20 or 30 per day at this time of year, each egg fertilized with sperm stored from that single mating flight years ago, each egg developing into a worker, a daughter, a new cell in the colonial body. She will never leave the nest again, never see the sun, never forage or explore or do anything but produce the next generation. And yet she is not a prisoner, not enslaved. She is the heart of the colony, the reason for its existence, the source from which everything flows. In late summer, when the colony is large, when resources are abundant, she will lay special eggs, unfertilized eggs that develop into males, and fertilized eggs that receive extra nutrition, extra care, and develop into new queens. These reproductives do not work, do not contribute to the colony's maintenance. They simply grow, storing energy, preparing for their own nuptial flight, for the moment when they will leave, mate, and perhaps, if they are lucky, if they survive the gauntlet of predators and weather and chance, found colonies of their own. This is the colony's true purpose, not survival, but reproduction, the thousands of workers, the elaborate nest, the complex behaviors. All of it exists to support this one goal, to produce new queens, new colonies, to continue the genetic line, to participate in the slow dance of evolution that has been unfolding for 100 million years. But for now, in this moment, the colony is focused on growth, on accumulation, on the patient work of building and feeding and tending. The trails extend further each day, exploring new territory, finding new resources. The nest deepens, expands, becomes more elaborate, and the population grows, doubling, tripling, approaching the thousands or tens of thousands that mark a mature colony of this species. I watch a worker carrying a dead insect, something she found on the forest floor, protein for the larvae. She struggles with the weight, moves slowly, pausing frequently, but she does not give up, does not abandon the load. And soon another worker joins her, then another, until 3 ants are cooperating, pulling and pushing, maneuvering the unwieldy cargo along the trail, through obstacles, around rocks and roots, working together without coordination, without communication beyond the simple fact of their simultaneous effort. This is emergence again, the pattern that underlies everything about ant colonies. Simple rules, simple behaviors, producing complex results. 3 ants pulling in slightly different directions, somehow managing to move in a unified path. No leader, no plan, just local interactions that sum to purposeful action. The day is fading now, the light growing softer, more golden, and the activity at the nest has slowed slightly, though it will not stop. Ants do not sleep in the way we understand sleep. They rest, briefly, intermittently, but the colony never sleeps, never closes. There are always workers active, always tasks being performed, always the hum of collective life continuing in darkness, in rain, in every season, every hour. As long as the queen lives, as long as the colony persists. I have been observing this colony through seasons now, watching it change, watching it adapt to the shifting conditions of the forest year. In spring, when the soil warms and the first plants emerge, the workers are frantic, urgent, rebuilding trails that winter disrupted, excavating tunnels that collapsed under frost. The colony is lean, hungry, recovering from months of reduced activity. And every seed, every insect, every drop of honeydew is precious. Summer brings abundance. The forest floor is rich with life, with opportunities, and the colony expands its foraging range, establishes satellite trails, exploits resources that are too distant or too ephemeral to warrant permanent roots. Workers range further, take greater risks, because the colony can afford losses now, can replace fallen foragers with a steady stream of new workers emerging from pupae every day. I watch them discover a fallen bird, a small thing, perhaps killed by a predator, or simply overcome by age or illness. Within hours, the carcass is covered with workers. They cannot carry it whole, cannot drag something so massive back to the nest, so they dismantle it, piece by piece, cutting away fragments of flesh, of skin, carrying these morsels back along the trail in an endless procession that will continue for days until nothing remains but bones and feathers. This is how ants process the world, through patient dismantling, through the collective effort of thousands of small actions. They are nature's recyclers, breaking down the dead, returning nutrients to the soil, converting complexity back into simple compounds that plants can use, that other organisms can access. They are essential, foundational, though they work in obscurity, in the hidden spaces beneath our notice. Autumn changes the rhythm again. The colony begins to prepare, though no individual ant understands what is coming. Workers collect seeds more urgently, storing them in chambers deep underground, below the frost line, where they will remain accessible even when the surface is frozen. The queen reduces her egg production, conserving energy, and the workers begin to cluster more tightly, to share warmth, to slow their metabolism in anticipation of the cold. I have learned that some ant species do not survive winter as colonies. The workers die, all of them, and only the mated queens endure, buried in the soil, in a state of dormancy called diapause, their bodies producing antifreeze compounds, glycerol, and other cryoprotectants that prevent ice crystals from forming in their cells, from rupturing their tissues. They wait, alone, through months of darkness and cold, and when spring returns, they emerge, begin digging, begin the cycle again. But the colony I am watching belongs to a species that winters communally. The workers survive, huddled together in the deepest chambers, moving very little, consuming the stored food in tiny increments, maintaining just enough metabolic activity to stay alive. They are dormant, but not dead, waiting, but not sleeping, existing in a state of suspended animation that can last for months. Winter here is harsh. The ground freezes solid, snow accumulates, and the forest becomes silent, empty of the insect hum that filled it during warmer months. But beneath the snow, beneath the frost, the colony persists, thousands of bodies pressed together, generating tiny amounts of heat, creating a microclimate that keeps the temperature just above lethal, just warm enough to prevent freezing. The queen is at the center of this cluster, the most protected position, surrounded by layers of workers who will die before she does, who exist, in part, to insulate, to coagulate her, to keep her alive through the winter so that she can resume laying eggs when spring returns. She is valuable beyond measure, irreplaceable, the only member of the colony capable of producing fertilized eggs, of creating new workers, of ensuring the colony's continuation. And yet, even she is mortal. Most queens of this species live 5 to 10 years, some as long as 15 or 20, but eventually, inevitably, they die. And when they do, the colony dies with them. The workers may persist for a season, may continue foraging and tending the last of the brood, but without new workers emerging, without the constant replacement of losses, the population dwindles, ages, and finally disappears. I think about the colonies that existed here before this one, in this same patch of forest, using perhaps the same rotting log, the same stone as a nest marker. There have been ant colonies in this location for thousands of years, tens of thousands, each one rising, flourishing, and fading, each one temporary, but part of an unbroken lineage, a continuity that transcends any individual colony's lifespan. The species persists even as colonies die. The genetic information passes through the queens, through the nuptial flights that mix genes from different colonies, that create new combinations, new variations on which selection can act. Some queens found successful colonies. Their genetic variants spread, become common, while others fail, their lineages ending before they truly begin. This is evolution occurring at two levels simultaneously. The colony as a unit, selected for its efficiency, its ability to gather resources and produce reproductives, and the individual genes, selected for their contribution to colony success, to worker productivity, to queen longevity. Both levels matter, both shape the trajectory of the species, and the result is the exquisite adaptation I am witnessing, the seamless coordination, the apparent purposefulness that emerges from blind genetic variation and differential survival. I have read about experiments where researchers manipulate ant colonies, remove the queen, or add workers from other nests, or introduce foreign pheromones, trying to understand the mechanisms that maintain order, that prevent chaos. And what they find is remarkable. The colony is resilient, but not infinitely so. Remove the queen and the workers become agitated, aggressive. Some of their ovaries activate. They begin to lay unfertilized eggs that develop into males, a last desperate attempt to salvage some reproductive output from the doomed colony. Add foreign workers, and they are usually killed, torn apart by guards who detect the subtle differences in cuticular hydrocarbons, the waxy compounds that coat each ant's exoskeleton and serve as a colony-specific signature, a chemical badge of membership. But sometimes, under certain conditions, like or dead, foreign workers are adopted, integrated, their chemical profiles gradually converging with those of their new nest mates until they are indistinguishable, until they belong. This chemical recognition system is ancient, refined over millions of years, and it is sophisticated beyond anything humans have achieved in security or identification. Each colony has a unique blend of hydrocarbons, determined partly by genetics, partly by diet, partly by the nest environment, and every ant in the colony carries this signature, updates it constantly through contact with nest mates, through grooming, through the simple act of walking through the nest and accumulating the colony scent. Guards at the entrance touch every returning forager, sampling their chemical profile, comparing it to the template they carry in their own nervous systems, and they make instantaneous decisions: admit or reject, ignore or attack, based on matches and mismatches measured in parts per billion, in ratios of compounds that we can barely detect even with sophisticated instruments. I watch a worker approach the nest, hesitate, be intercepted by a guard. There is a moment of tension, antennae touching, chemical information flowing, and then the guard steps aside. The worker enters, the crisis averted. She belonged. She passed the test. She carried the right signature, and the colony's integrity is maintained. But what defines the colony, really? Is it the individuals who are constantly being born and dying, who turn over completely every few months or years? Or is it the nest, the physical structure, which persists longer than any individual, but eventually erodes, collapses, is abandoned? Or is it the queen, the genetic founder, whose body is the source of every worker, whose death marks the end? Or is it something more abstract, the pattern, the organization, the distributed information system that exists in the collective behavior, in the pheromone trails and chemical signals, in the shared knowledge that no individual possesses, but that guides the whole? I suspect the colony is all of these and none of them. It is a process more than a thing, a temporary eddy in the flow of energy and matter through the ecosystem. It persists because it successfully extracts resources and converts them into reproductives, because it solves the daily problems of survival through distributed cognition, because it exists in a state of dynamic equilibrium, constantly breaking down and rebuilding, losing workers and creating new ones, consuming food and producing waste, but maintaining, somehow, a continuity of form and function. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows through the forest, and I notice that the foraging activity has changed. The trails are less busy. Workers are returning more than leaving, carrying in the last loads of the day, preparing for the cooler night ahead when activity will slow, though never stop entirely. The colony adjusts its rhythm to the rhythm of the world, to temperature and light, and the availability of resources, not through central planning, but through local decisions, each worker responding to her immediate environment, to the presence or absence of nest mates, to the strength of pheromone trails, to hunger or satiation, to threat or opportunity. And in these millions of small responses, these individual decisions made by creatures with ganglia instead of brains, there emerges something that looks from a distance like intelligence, like foresight, like purpose. The colony seems to know what it needs, seems to anticipate challenges, seems to solve problems. But this knowing exists nowhere. This anticipation is an illusion created by feedback loops and evolved responses. This problem-solving is simply the statistical outcome of countless trials, countless errors, countless small adjustments. I am beginning to see that the colony is less like an organism and more like an ecosystem in miniature, a community of related individuals engaged in constant interaction, constant exchange, creating together something that none of them could create alone. They are cooperating, but not altruistically, not selflessly. Each worker is propagating her own genes indirectly through the reproductives she helps to create, through the queen she feeds and protects. She shares more genetic material with her sisters than she would with her own offspring. Thanks to the peculiar genetics of hymenopterans, and so helping the colony is helping herself, or rather, helping the genes they share. This is the insight that unlocked the puzzle of ant sociality, the understanding that evolution operates on genes, not individuals, not colonies, and that genes can propagate themselves through bodies they do not directly inhabit, through nieces and nephews, through sisters and half-sisters, as long as the relationship is close enough, the benefit large enough. The workers sacrifice their own reproduction, but their genetic material persists, spreads through the queens they help to create, through the intricate mathematics of inclusive fitness. And yet, knowing this, understanding the genetic calculus that underlies every behavior, every sacrifice, does not diminish the wonder of what I am witnessing. If anything, it deepens it, because I am watching evolution in action, watching genes expressing themselves through bodies, through behaviors, through chemical signals and neural pathways that were sculpted over millions of years by the simple fact of differential survival. The worker carrying a seed is not thinking about her genes, not calculating her inclusive fitness. She is simply following instructions written in her nervous system, responding to stimuli in the way her anatomy dictates, and yet the result, the aggregate effect of millions of such responses across millions of colonies across millions of years, is this elaborate dance, this intricate cooperation, this society without a speech or writing or law. I think about the intelligence distributed through the colony, the way information flows not through neurons in a single brain, but through interactions between bodies, through chemical messages passed from ant to ant, through the physical arrangement of workers in space, through the patterns of traffic on trails and the density of individuals in chambers. The colony computes, processes information, makes decision, but the computation is embodied, spatial, chemical, nothing like the electrochemical signals firing in my own brain as I watch and wonder. There are researchers who study this, who build mathematical models of ant behavior, who try to capture in equations the rules that govern individual actions and predict collective outcomes. And they have found that remarkably simple rules can generate remarkably complex behaviors. An ant that follows pheromone trails, that deposits pheromones when carrying food, that moves randomly when trails are absent, can participate in a system that finds the shortest path between nest and food source, that allocates workers efficiently across multiple resources, that adapts to changing conditions without any central coordinator. This has inspired human engineers, computer scientists, who have developed algorithms based on anti-foraging, optimization techniques that solve problems in telecommunications, in routing, in logistics. The ants figured this out first through evolutionary trial and error, through the survival of colonies that happen to have slightly better rules, slightly more efficient responses, and now we are learning from them reverse engineering solutions that emerged without design, without intention, without understanding. I watch the nest entrance, the steady flow of workers in and out, and I try to imagine what it would be like to be one of them, to experience the world through antennae instead of eyes, to navigate by scent instead of sight, to exist in a body barely larger than a grain of rice, with a lifespan measured in weeks or months, with no memory of yesterday, no conception of tomorrow, only the eternal present, the immediate stimulus, the next task. And yet they are not simple, not just automatons. Studies have shown that ants can learn, can remember locations, can recognize landmarks, can even count steps to navigate back to the nest after a foraging trip. Their brains are tiny, containing perhaps 250,000 neurons compared to the 86 billion in a human brain, but those neurons are sufficient, are enough to support complex behaviors, flexible responses, individual variation in personality and tendency. Some workers are bold, aggressive, quick to explore new areas, while others are cautious, conservative, preferring established trails and familiar territory. Some are more likely to respond to alarm pheromones, to rush toward danger, while others continue their tasks, ignore the disturbance. These differences are not assigned, not trained. They emerge from subtle variations in neural wiring, in hormone levels, in gene expression, and they contribute to colony success by ensuring diversity of response, resilience in the face of uncertainty. The colony benefits from having some workers who take risks, who discover new resources, and some who play it safe, who maintain existing operations. It benefits from having aggressive defenders and patient nurses, from having specialists and generalists, from having a portfolio of behavioral types that can be deployed flexibly depending on need. This is evolution at the level of personality, of temperament, selecting not just for the optimal behavior, but for the optimal distribution of behaviors across the workforce. I realize that I have been here for hours, that the light has shifted from gold to amber, to the deep blue of approaching dusk, and still I am reluctant to leave, still drawn to the quiet drama playing out at my feet. There is something meditative about this, about observing life at this scale, about letting go of human time, human concerns, and sinking into the rhythm of the colony, the patient accumulation of small actions, the unhurried certainty of instinct. The air is cooling now. The sounds of the forest are changing, birds calling their last songs before settling for the night, the rustle of leaves as larger animals move through the understory. And the ants continue their work, continue their trails, continue the tasks that have no beginning and no end, only the eternal middle, the perpetual maintenance of order against entropy. I think about all the ant colonies in this forest, in forests around the world, in deserts and grasslands and rainforests, and even in cities, in sidewalk cracks and building foundations and parks. There are perhaps 20 quadrillion individual ants alive at this moment, a number so large it loses meaning, a biomass that equals or exceeds that of all humans. And each one is part of a colony, part of a distributed intelligence, part of a society that has been refining itself for longer than mountains have stood, longer than rivers have flowed in their current channels. They were here before us. They will likely be here after us. They have survived ice ages and asteroid impacts and mass extinctions. They have adapted to every terrestrial environment except the polar ice caps. They have diversified into more than 12,000 known species, each with its own ecology, its own behaviors, its own solution to the problem of collective life, and they continue to evolve, continue to experiment, continue to explore the space of possible societies. The last light is fading from the canopy now. The forest floor is deep in shadow, and I can barely see the trails anymore, barely distinguish individual workers from the dark soil they traverse. But I know they are there, know they will continue through the night, through every night, as they have for countless nights before this one, as they will for countless nights to come. I stand slowly, careful not to disturb the nest, not to crush the trails I have been observing, and I feel a strange reluctance, a sense that I am leaving something unfinished, though I know there is no finish, no conclusion to this story, only the ongoing unfolding of colony life, the perpetual present that ants inhabit, the timeless cycle of foraging and feeding and tending and building. The colony will be here tomorrow, and the day after it will grow, will send out new trails, will face new challenges, and if I return in a year, it may still be here, larger perhaps, or smaller if the winter was harsh, or gone entirely if the queen has died, replaced by a new colony, a daughter colony founded by one of this year's virgin queens, continuing the lineage in a new form, in a new location. This is how life persists, not through individual survival, but through reproduction, through the creation of new generations that carry forward with variations, with innovations, the patterns that proved successful. The colony is a vehicle for genes, a temporary structure that genes build to propagate themselves. And when it has served its purpose, when it has produced new queens who have mated and dispersed, it can dissolve, disappear, return to the soil from which it came. I walk slowly back through the darkening forest, my mind still full of trails and chambers, of workers and larvae, of pheromones and mandibles, and the patient dismantling of a world too large for any single ant to comprehend. I am thinking about scale, about how meaning changes with perspective, about how what appears as chaos from one angle reveals itself as order from another. The individual ant knows nothing of the colony. The colony knows nothing of the forest knows nothing of the planet. And yet, each level emerges from the level below. Each scale of organization arising from the interactions of components that remain unaware of the whole they create. I am part of this too, my cells cooperating without knowing me, my thoughts emerging from neurons that have no thoughts, my consciousness arising from unconscious processes, from chemistry and electricity, and the ancient legacy of evolution. The ants have taught me this, have reminded me that intelligence is not singular, not confined to brains and bodies, that it can be distributed, emergent, collective, that complexity does not require comprehension, that purpose does not require intention, that order can arise from simple rules followed faithfully, repeatedly, across vast stretches of time. I reach the edge of the forest, where the trees thin and the trail leads back to human spaces, to roads and buildings and the constructed world I inhabit. But I carry the colony with me now, carry the image of those trails, those patient workers, those million years of refinement. And I know I will return, will kneel again in the leaf litter, will watch again the hypnotic flow of tiny bodies along invisible paths, will sink again into that deep time, that slow rhythm, that world within worlds, The stars are emerging overhead, the same stars that shone on the Cretaceous forests where the first ants appeared, the same stars that will shine on whatever comes after us, after the ants, after everything we know has been transformed beyond recognition by the patient work of evolution, of geology, of time itself, and somewhere beneath my feet, in nests I cannot see, in chambers I will never enter, the colonies continue. The workers move through darkness. The queens lay eggs, the larvae grow, the pupae metamorphose, and the great wheel turns, the ancient pattern repeating, life feeding on life, complexity emerging from simplicity, order arising from chaos, again and again and again, until there is only the darkness and the forest and the silent knowing that somewhere in the deep places the work continues, has always continued, will always continue, as long as there is earth and sun and the possibility of life organizing itself against the inevitable pull of entropy. The colony persists in its own eternal present, unaware of past or future, knowing only the immediate task, the next step, the trail ahead, fading into shadow, into silence, into the soft embrace of night. I stand at the edge of a field, and beneath my feet lies something ancient, something alive in ways I have never quite understood until this moment. The soil stretches out before me in every direction, dark and rich and impossibly complex, and I find myself drawn downward in my thoughts, not into the sky or the distant horizon, but into the earth itself, into the quiet world that exists just below the surface of everything I see. The ground here is soft, yielding slightly under my weight, and I notice how the light catches the texture of it, the way each particle seems to hold its own small shadow, its own particular shape. There are colors here I had not expected, not just brown or black, but hints of red, traces of gold, the faintest suggestions of gray and orange where minerals have oxidized over time, where iron has transformed, where clay has settled into its current form after journeys measured not in years but in epochs. I kneel down, and the smell rises to meet me, earthy and profound, a scent that seems to contain multitudes. It is not unpleasant, far from it. There is something almost sweet beneath the mineral tang, something organic and ongoing, the smell of transformation itself, of things becoming other things, of boundaries dissolving between what was once alive and what will live again. When I take a small handful and let it fall slowly through my fingers, I can feel the different textures. Some particles are fine as powder, almost silky, while others are coarser, tiny fragments of rock worn down over time scales I can barely conceive. And there is moisture here too, not wet exactly, but present, as if the soil itself is breathing, drawing water up from below and releasing it in measures so gradual they escape easy observation. I think about what this substance actually is, and the answer unfolds like a story with no clear beginning. This soil was not always here, not in this form. Once, impossibly long ago, there was only rock, bare stone exposed to sun and wind and the patient work of weather. And somehow, through processes both violent and subtle, that rock began to break apart. Frost wedged into cracks and expanded, splitting stone along invisible fault lines. Rain fell and fell again, each drop carrying away the smallest fragments. Wind scoured exposed surfaces, grinding them down grain by grain, particle by particle. But that was only the beginning, because soil is not simply powdered rock. It is something stranger, something that required the arrival of life itself. I imagine the first organisms, microscopic pioneers, bacteria and archaea that found purchase on bare stone, that secreted acids capable of dissolving minerals, that died and left their organic matter as a thin film, a foundation for what would follow. Then lichens, those peculiar partnerships between fungi and algae, spreading across rock faces in patterns like frozen explosions of color. They too contributed, their bodies breaking down stone, their deaths adding layer upon layer of organic material, and then, eventually, plants, first simple ones clinging to whatever soil had accumulated in crevices and depressions, and later, much later, the forests and grasslands that could transform landscapes entirely. Their roots pushed deep, fracturing rock from below. Their leaves fell and decomposed. Their trunks toppled and rotted. Their pollen and seeds and the waste products of their living all mingled with the mineral substrate, creating something entirely new, something that was neither purely mineral nor purely organic, but both, woven together in proportions that varied from place to place, from one handful to the next. I let my eyes trace across the field, and I understand now that every point I see represents a slightly different history. Over there, where the land rises slightly, the soil might be thinner, more recently exposed, while here in this low area, sediment has accumulated over centuries, washed down from higher ground, deposited in layers like the pages of a book written in mud and time. And beneath the surface, right now, invisible to me, but no less real, there is a world of astonishing complexity. A single teaspoon of this soil, just one small measure, might contain more organisms than there are people on Earth. Bacteria numbering in the billions. Fungi sending their thread-like hyphae through the spaces between particles. Nematodes, tiny round worms twisting through films of water. Mites and springtails and creatures without common names, all living their lives in what is to them a vast landscape of caverns and passages and surfaces to traverse. These organisms are not merely present, they are actively creating the soil, transforming it moment by moment. Bacteria decompose organic matter, breaking down complex molecules into simpler forms, releasing nutrients that plants can absorb. Fungi form partnerships with plant roots, extending their reach, trading nutrients for sugars in exchanges so refined they suggest something like negotiation, like cooperation across kingdoms of life. I think about the earthworms I cannot see, but know are here, moving through their tunnels, consuming soil and organic matter, processing it through their bodies, and depositing it transformed. Their castings are richer than the surrounding soil, more fertile. Their tunnels allow air and water to penetrate deeper. Each worm is an engineer, reshaping the underground landscape through the simple fact of its existence, through its hunger and its movement, and its patient tunneling through the dark. And I realize that what I am looking at, what I am touching, is not a static thing, not a stage upon which life performs, but life itself. Soil is alive, not metaphorically, but literally. It breathes in its way, consuming oxygen in the countless metabolisms of its inhabitants. It grows and develops and matures. Young soils are different from old ones, shallow soils from deep. Each has its character, its structure, its particular community of organisms. The light is changing now, growing softer, and the field takes on a different quality. The shadows lengthen, and I can see more clearly the subtle variations in the surface, the places where soil has been disturbed, the paths where nothing grows quite the same. There is history written here in textures and colors, in the distribution of stones, in which plants have chosen to root themselves and which have not. I find myself thinking backward, not in years or decades, but in eons, trying to imagine a time before soil existed at all, when the earth was young and raw, when the surface of the planet bore no resemblance to the quiet field where I now stand. The continents were different then, arranged in configurations that would seem alien, and the atmosphere itself was not the air I breathe now, but something harsher, thinner, incapable of supporting the life that would eventually make soil possible. In those earliest days, perhaps 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was still cooling from its violent formation. Meteors and asteroids struck the surface with devastating regularity. Each impact released energy beyond comprehension, melting rock, vaporizing whatever primitive atmosphere tried to form. The surface was molten in places, a hellscape of lava flows and volcanic eruptions. And there was no soil, no plants, no organic matter of any kind, only sterile rock and ash, and the slow heat of a planet finding its shape. But even then, even in that hostile beginning, the processes that would eventually create soil were starting. The rock cooled and solidified, forming the first solid crust, and immediately the forces of weathering began their patient work. Temperature fluctuations caused expansion and contraction, creating stress within the rock, fracturing it along planes of weakness. Water, when it finally condensed from the cooling atmosphere and fell as rain, found its way into these cracks, and the chemical reactions began. Minerals dissolved, recombined, transformed into new compounds. The first sediments accumulated, washed into low places by the endless rain, settling in layers that would eventually become sedimentary rock themselves. For billions of years, this continued a world of geology without biology. Rock broke down into smaller and smaller pieces, but it was not yet soil in any meaningful sense. It lacked the essential component, the organic matter that would change everything. The earth was waiting, though of course it did not know it was waiting, for the emergence of life itself. And life came first in the oceans, single-celled organisms so simple they barely qualified as alive by our standards, yet they possessed something miraculous, the ability to reproduce, to metabolize, to change their environment through their existence. For perhaps 3 billion years, these microscopic pioneers remained in the water, evolving slowly, developing new strategies for survival, learning to harness energy from sunlight through the chemistry of photosynthesis, and in doing so, releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, transforming the very air, creating the conditions that would allow more complex life to follow. The land remained barren, sterile expanses of rock, baked by unfiltered sunlight, scoured by wind, carved by water. But the oxygen was accumulating, the atmosphere was changing, and eventually, approximately 450 million years ago, life began its tentative colonization of the terrestrial realm. The first pioneers were likely organisms like cyanobacteria and algae, forming thin films on wet rock surfaces, clinging to existence in the harsh conditions. They were followed by early fungi and simple plant-like organisms, each generation expanding the beachhead, each death contributing organic matter to the mineral substrate. I try to imagine those early landscapes, and they seem impossibly strange. The rocks would have been dark, unsoftened by vegetation, the sky perhaps a different shade of blue. The silence would have been absolute, no birds, no insects, no rustle of wind through grass or leaves, just stone and water and the patient work of organisms too small to see with the naked eye, coating surfaces, dying, accumulating, beginning the transformation from mineral to something more. The first true plants, with vascular systems that could transport water and nutrients, appeared around 400 million years ago. These were simple organisms by modern standards, lacking flowers or seeds, reproducing through spores, but they possessed roots. And those roots changed everything. They pushed into the accumulating sediment, fracturing rock from within, secreting acids that dissolved minerals, extracting nutrients and leaving cavities and passages in their wake. When these plants died, their bodies added substantial organic matter, creating pockets of material that was distinctly different from pure rock, darker, richer, capable of holding more water, more hospitable to the next generation of plants. The pace accelerated. At first, the changes must have been almost imperceptible. A slight darkening of the rock surface, a thin film of organic residue. But as plants diversified and spread, as they grew larger and more complex, the accumulation of soil deepened. By 360 million years ago, there were forests, great stands of primitive trees, ferns and horsetails reaching heights of 30 meters or more. Their roots penetrated deep into the developing soil. Their fallen trunks created massive deposits of organic matter. Their leaves, dropping in seasonal cycles, blanketed the ground, decomposing over months and years, becoming humus, that dark, rich component of soil that holds moisture and nutrients so effectively. And with the plants came the animals, first invertebrates, millipedes, and primitive insects and arachnids, crawling across the forest floor, feeding on the plant matter, on each other, their waste products added to the soil. Their bodies eventually joined it, and they were not passive inhabitants. The millipedes burrowed, mixing organic matter with mineral particles. The insects fed and defecated and died in cycles that processed nutrients through living tissue and returned them transformed. Each organism was part of an increasingly complex system, a web of interactions that created soil as a byproduct of simply living and dying and consuming and being consumed. Below the surface, invisible but essential, the microbial communities were diversifying. Bacteria specialized in breaking down specific compounds. Fungi developed intricate networks, their hyphae spreading through the soil like neural networks, connecting plants, transferring nutrients and even chemical signals between distant individuals. These fungi could decompose the toughest plant materials, breaking down lignin and cellulose that nothing else could digest, releasing the nutrients locked within, making them available for new growth. The process was self-reinforcing. More plants meant more organic matter, which meant richer soil, which meant more plants could grow and thrive. The soil deepened year by year, century by century. In some places it accumulated to depths of meters, each layer recording the conditions of its formation, the climate, the vegetation, the organisms present at that time. I think about the earthworms, those humble creatures that seem so ordinary, and I learn that they are relative newcomers to the story. The first earthworms appeared perhaps 120 million years ago, long after soil itself had formed, but their impact was profound. An earthworm consumes soil, processes it through its digestive system, and excretes it transformed. A single earthworm might process 10 tons of soil in its lifetime, mixing layers, incorporating organic matter, creating channels that allow air and water to penetrate. In areas where earthworms are abundant, the entire structure of the soil is shaped by their activity, their tunnels and castings creating a texture, an architecture that would not otherwise exist. The continents were still moving, drifting on the plastic mantle beneath, colliding and separating, throwing up mountain ranges and opening ocean basins, and each geological event affected soil formation. Mountains rose, their peaks subject to intense weathering, frost and wind breaking them down. Streams carried the sediment to lowlands, depositing it in fertile floodplains and deltas. Glaciers advanced and retreated, grinding rock to fine powder, leaving behind mineral-rich deposits when they melted. Each climate, each landscape, each combination of parent rock and precipitation and temperature created its own characteristic soil, its own profile of layers and textures and colors. In tropical regions where warmth and moisture combined, decomposition happened rapidly. Organic matter broke down almost as quickly as it fell. The soils became deep, but paradoxically low in nutrients. Everything was cycled so quickly through living organisms that little accumulated. The soils took on reddish hues from oxidized iron. Clays formed and dominated the mineral fraction. In colder regions, decomposition slowed dramatically. Organic matter accumulated in thick layers. The soils were darker, richer in carbon. In wetlands, where water saturation prevented oxygen from reaching the organic matter, decomposition nearly stopped. Peat formed, layers of partially decayed plant material meters thick, recording thousands of years of growth in compressed strata. In grasslands, a different pattern emerged. The grasses sent their roots deep, forming dense mats of living and dead tissue underground. When the roots died, they left channels and added enormous quantities of organic matter. The result was some of the richest soils on Earth, dark and deep and fertile, capable of supporting the immense productivity of prairie ecosystems. I kneel again, running my fingers through the soil, and I understand that what I am touching is the product of all this history. This particular soil formed over thousands of years at minimum, possibly tens of thousands. Each particle arrived through its own journey. Some eroded from distant mountains, carried by wind or water. Some formed in place from the breakdown of bedrock below. The organic matter came from plants that grew here, from the animals that fed on them, from the microorganisms that processed their remains. The profile beneath me, if I could dig down and see it in cross-section, would reveal distinct layers at the surface, the darkest layer, rich in organic matter, where plant roots are most dense, where biological activity is most intense. Below that, a zone where minerals have been altered, where clays have formed, where iron and aluminum compounds have migrated, and deeper still, less altered material, fragments of the parent rock, the source material from which everything above derived. This layering is not arbitrary. It reflects processes. Each horizon tells a story of what happens at that depth. of how water moves, of where roots penetrate, of which organisms can survive. In wetter climates, certain minerals dissolve near the surface and precipitate lower down, creating hard pans and layers of accumulated clay. In drier regions, salts might accumulate, forming white crusts or layers that restrict plant growth. I notice a small depression in the field, and I understand that water collects there, that the soil is different because of it, probably darker, higher in organic matter, perhaps glade, showing the gray colors that develop when soil remains saturated, when oxygen is excluded and iron compounds are chemically reduced. Every variation in the landscape creates a variation in the soil. Every slope and flat, every sunny exposure and shaded hollow develops its own character over time. And through all of this, through hundreds of millions of years of development, soil has been more than just a passive medium. It has shaped the evolution of life itself. Plants adapted to specific soil conditions, developing preferences for certain pH ranges, certain nutrient levels, certain textures. Some plants specialized in nutrient-poor soils, evolving strategies to survive with minimal resources. Others became dependent on rich, deep soils, growing rapidly but unable to tolerate harsh conditions. The distribution of plant species across landscapes is in large part a map of soil variation, each species finding its niche, its preferred substrate, and animals, too, evolved in relationship to soil. Burrowing creatures developed, earthworms and insects and eventually mammals, using the soil as shelter, as a stable environment protected from temperature extremes and predators. Their evolution in turn shaped the soil, their burrowing and feeding creating new structures, new pathways for water and air, new patterns of nutrient distribution. The field around me grows quieter as the light continues to fade, and I sit here thinking about the immensity of time required to create what I see. The soil beneath me is young in geological terms, perhaps 10,000 years old, formed since the last glaciers retreated from this region. Yet even that span, 100 centuries, is beyond my capacity to truly comprehend. I can recite the number, but I cannot feel its weight, cannot imagine the succession of seasons, the countless cycles of growth and decay, the patient accumulation of organic matter, and the slow transformation of minerals. Yet here it is, real and present, and I find myself wondering about the organisms living within it at this very moment, the invisible multitudes conducting their lives in the darkness below. I think about the bacteria first, because they are the most numerous, the most diverse. A single gram of soil might contain 10,000 different species, each with its own particular role, its own metabolic specialty. Some bacteria are decomposers, breaking down complex organic molecules into simpler forms. They produce enzymes that cleave chemical bonds, that transform proteins into amino acids, carbohydrates into simple sugars. These bacteria are essential. Without them, the nutrients locked in dead tissue would remain unavailable. The cycle would break. The whole system would grind to a halt. Other bacteria are nitrogen fixers, possessing the remarkable ability to take nitrogen gas from the air trapped in soil pores and convert it into ammonia, into forms that plants can absorb and use. This process requires enormous energy, yet these bacteria perform it constantly. Some live freely in the soil, while others form intimate partnerships with plant roots. colonizing special nodules where the plant provides sugars and the bacteria provide nitrogen, a trade that benefits both parties, a cooperation written in chemistry. And there are bacteria that oxidize minerals, that derive energy from transforming iron or sulfur or manganese compounds. They live in realms of pure chemistry, in gradients of oxygen and pH that would be toxic to most life, yet they thrive there, carving out niches in the chemical landscape of the soil. Their metabolisms alter the soil itself, precipitating minerals, creating new compounds, contributing to the weathering that continues even now, even after millions of years. The fungi form their own kingdom of influence. Their hyphae, those thread-like filaments, extend through the soil in networks of astonishing complexity. A single fungal individual might have hyphae stretching for kilometers, woven through a volume of soil, connecting hundreds or thousands of plants. The largest organism on Earth is not a whale or a giant sequoia, but a fungal mycelium in Oregon, covering thousands of acres. All one individual, one genetic entity expressing itself through this vast underground network. These fungi serve many roles. Some are decomposers, particularly skilled at breaking down lignin, that tough polymer that gives wood its structure. They produce enzymes that can cleave its complex bonds, releasing the carbon locked within, making it available for other organisms. When I see a fallen log covered in mushrooms, I am seeing only the fruiting bodies, the reproductive structures. The real organism is inside the wood, digesting it from within, transforming solid timber into soft humus over years or decades. Other fungi form mycorrhizal associations, partnerships with plant roots so ancient and so fundamental that most plants cannot survive without them. The fungal hyphae extend far beyond where roots can reach, exploring tiny pores and crevices, accessing water and nutrients that would otherwise remain beyond the plant's grasp. In return, the plant provides sugars, products of photosynthesis, feeding the fungus that cannot make its own food. The exchange is so finely tuned that the fungus can sense what the plant needs, providing more phosphorus when it is scarce, more nitrogen when that is limiting, adjusting its service to the plant's requirements. And these mycorrhizal networks do something even more remarkable. They connect different plants, even plants of different species. A tree can be linked through fungal hyphae to its neighbors, to seedlings growing in its shade, to plants dozens of meters away. Through these connections, resources can flow. A large tree with deep roots accessing groundwater might share that water through the network with smaller plants suffering from drought. A dying tree might transfer its remaining nutrients to its offspring through fungal intermediaries. The forest is not just a collection of individual trees competing for resources, but a community, interconnected, sharing information and materials through the living internet of fungal mycelia. I imagine this network beneath me right now, invisible filaments crossing and recrossing, forming junctions, creating pathways. It is a landscape at a scale I cannot directly perceive, where distances are measured in micrometers, where a grain of sand is a boulder, where a pore space is a cavern. The organisms at this scale experience the soil as a three-dimensional matrix, a world of surfaces and interfaces and gradients. The nematodes move through this microscopic landscape like serpents, their bodies transparent, elongated. They number in the millions in a square meter of soil, some species feeding on bacteria, engulfing them and digesting them, regulating bacterial populations through predation. Other nematodes feed on fungi, puncturing the hyphae and consuming the contents. Still others are parasites, invading plant roots, or even parasitizing other nematodes. They reproduce rapidly, generations turning over in weeks, their populations fluctuating with the availability of food, with moisture, with temperature. The arthropods are giants by comparison, mites, barely visible to the naked eye, crawl across soil particles like astronauts on an alien world. Some are predators, hunting nematodes and other mites, equipped with specialized mouthparts for grasping and piercing. Others are detritivores, feeding on dead organic matter, shredding leaves and plant fragments into smaller pieces, increasing the surface area available for bacteria and fungi to colonize. Their feeding accelerates decomposition, converts large pieces of litter into fine particulate organic matter that can be more easily processed. Springtails, those peculiar hexapods with their springing appendage, bounce through the leaf litter and upper soil layers. They too are detritivores, but they also graze on fungi, controlling fungal populations, dispersing spores as they move. Their bodies are covered in hydrophobic scales that repel water, allowing them to survive in saturated conditions where other arthropods would drown. In a handful of rich forest soil, there might be hundreds of springtails, representing dozens of species, each with its own feeding preferences, its own tolerance for moisture and temperature. And then there are the larger inhabitants, the ones I might actually see if I dig carefully. Beetle larvae, pale and C-shaped, chewing through organic matter. Their mandibles work constantly, consuming and fragmenting. Their guts contain communities of microorganisms that help them digest, that break down cellulose and lignin. The larvae might spend years underground, growing slowly, accumulating mass, before finally pupating and emerging as adults. Centipedes hunt through the soil, predators equipped with venomous claws, pursuing smaller arthropods. They are fast, agile, sensing vibrations through the soil particles, tracking prey through the labyrinth of pores and channels. Millipedes follow different strategies, moving more slowly, feeding on decaying plant matter, their many legs pushing them through tight spaces, their bodies armored against predators. The earthworms, when present, are ecosystem engineers. Their impact on soil is profound and multifaceted. As they burrow, they consume soil and organic matter, passing it through their digestive system, where it is ground by muscular contractions, mixed with digestive enzymes, inoculated with bacteria from the worm's gut. The castings they deposit are chemically and structurally different from the surrounding soil, higher in nutrients, more stable, better aggregated. A single earthworm might process 40 to 50 times its own body weight in soil each year. Multiply that by the hundreds or thousands of worms in a hectare, and the cumulative effect is staggering. Their burrows create macropores, channels that allow rapid infiltration of water, that permit gas exchange between the atmosphere and deep soil layers. Plant roots follow these burrows, exploiting the paths of least resistance, accessing deeper resources. The burrow walls are lined with mucus and castings, creating surfaces enriched in nutrients, zones of intense microbial activity, hotspots within the soil ecosystem. I think about how these organisms interact, how they form food webs of dizzying complexity, Bacteria consume dead organic matter. Nematodes eat bacteria. Mites eat nematodes. Centipedes eat mites. And when any of these dies, bacteria consume them in turn. The carbon and nutrients cycle through this web, transformed repeatedly, stored temporarily in living tissue, released upon death, reincorporated. The system is dynamic, constantly in flux, populations rising and falling with the seasons, with rainfall, with the availability of fresh organic inputs. And all of this is happening in darkness. The soil organisms live without light, navigating their world through chemical signals, through touch, through vibrations. They sense gradients of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Following these gradients to favorable conditions, they detect the chemical signatures of their food, of their predators, of potential mates. The soil is full of chemical information, pheromones and allelochemicals and defensive compounds, a language written in molecules. The structure of the soil itself influences everything. In sandy soils with large particles and large pores, water drains quickly, air penetrates easily, but moisture retention is poor. The organisms here must tolerate fluctuating conditions, periods of plenty alternating with drought. In clay soils with tiny particles packed tightly, water is held more tenaciously, but air exchanges restricted. When saturated, clay soils can become anaerobic, oxygen depleted, favoring different communities of microorganisms. Those that can respire using sulfate or nitrate instead of oxygen. The ideal from an agricultural or ecological perspective is a balance, a loam with a mixture of particle sizes, enough large pores for drainage and aeration, enough small pores for water retention, enough clay to hold nutrients, enough organic matter to support biological activity. This structure is not static. It is created and maintained by the organisms living within it. Fungal hyphae bind particles together. Bacterial secretions glue them into aggregates. Roots grow and die, leaving channels. Earthworms mix and churn. The soil is constantly being made and remade by the life it supports. I consider the seasonal rhythms, how the soil changes through the year. In spring, as temperatures rise and moisture from snowmelt saturates the ground, biological activity surges. Microorganisms that were dormant through winter resume their metabolisms. Reproduction accelerates. Plant roots begin their growth, pushing through the soil, secreting compounds that stimulate microbial activity in the rhizosphere, that narrow zone immediately surrounding roots where interactions are most intense. Summer brings warmth, but often brings drought. The surface soil dries. Organisms retreat to deeper layers where moisture persists, or enter dormant states, producing resistant spores or cysts that can survive desiccation. The pace of the decomposition slows. Nutrients become less available as microbial activity declines. Plants stress, their roots releasing distress signals that their mycorrhizal partners might respond to, providing more water when possible. Autumn arrives with cooling temperatures and often with rain. A pulse of organic matter falls as leaves drop, as annual plants die back. This fresh input of resources stimulates another surge of activity. Decomposers colonize the new material, fragmenting it, beginning the process of transformation. The soil organisms fatten on this abundance, preparing for winter, storing energy, reproducing one last time before the cold arrives. Winter imposes dormancy on most soil life. Temperatures drop below freezing, at least in the surface layers. Metabolism slows dramatically. Many organisms survive in resistant forms, waiting. Some maintain minimal activity in deeper soil where temperature remains above freezing, where the insulation of snow cover moderates the cold. Ice crystals form in the soil pores, changing the physical structure, sometimes disrupting aggregates, sometimes creating new patterns of cracking and fracturing when freeze-thaw cycles repeat. But even in winter, the soil is not truly dead. Processes continue, just more slowly. Water still moves, albeit sometimes as ice. Chemical reactions still occur, though their rates are reduced. And with the first warmth of spring, everything quickens again. The cycle resumes, endless and renewing. I think about the time scales at which different processes operate. Some bacteria divide every 20 minutes under ideal conditions, their populations doubling and doubling again, reaching enormous numbers in days. Fungi grow more slowly, extending their hyphae millimeters per day, but persisting for years, perhaps decades. Earthworms might live 5 to 10 years, reproducing slowly, investing in long life rather than rapid reproduction. The soil itself changes most slowly of all, accumulating organic matter at rates measured in years per centimeter, developing structure over decades or centuries. Yet within this slow accumulation, within these patient rhythms of growth and decay, something else was beginning, something that would transform the story of soil in ways both profound and troubling. Humans were arriving, and they were noticing the soil, noticing its differences, beginning to understand that their survival depended on it. The first humans were hunters and gatherers, moving across landscapes, following game and seasons. They observed which plants grew where, which soils supported which vegetation. They learned to read the land, to recognize that dark soil in river valleys meant abundant plant growth, that certain soil colors or textures indicated good digging for edible roots, but they did not alter the soil, not intentionally. They were part of the ecosystem, participants in the cycles, but not yet controllers of them. Then, approximately 10,000 years ago, in several different regions of the world, independently, humans began to cultivate plants, to practice agriculture. This changed everything in the Fertile Crescent. In the valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, people began planting wheat and barley, selecting seeds from the best plants, saving them, sowing them deliberately. They were manipulating the soil now, breaking it with simple tools, removing competing vegetation, concentrating their efforts on small plots where they could tend their crops. The soil responded to this attention. Initially, the yields must have seemed miraculous. The natural fertility accumulated over millennia. The nutrients stored in organic matter and minerals all became available to the crops humans chose to grow. Harvests were abundant. Populations grew. Settlements became permanent. People no longer needed to follow the migrations of animals or the seasonal availability of wild plants. They could stay in one place, building villages, then towns, then cities, all supported by the productivity of cultivated soil. But there was a hidden cost, a consequence that would only become apparent over time. The crops humans planted were mostly annuals, plants that completed their life cycle in a single growing season. Unlike the perennial grasses and deep-rooted plants of natural ecosystems, these crops did not maintain soil structure. Their roots were shallow, offering less organic matter to the soil. And at harvest, The entire plant was removed, taken away to be eaten or stored. The nutrients it contained did not return to the soil. The cycle was broken. Year after year this continued. The soil gave and gave and gave, but received less and less in return. The organic matter content declined. The structure degraded. What had been rich and dark and crumbly became paler, harder, more prone to erosion. Yields began to fall. Sometimes this happened slowly, over generations, so that no single farmer noticed the decline. They only knew that grandfather's stories of abundant harvests seemed exaggerated, impossible. Other times the degradation was catastrophic. In Mesopotamia, the irrigation systems that had seemed so ingenious, that had allowed crops to grow in the desert, began to cause problems. The water they diverted from the rivers carried dissolved salts. When the water evaporated from the fields under the intense sun, the salts remained, accumulating, crystallizing. After centuries of irrigation, some of the most fertile land became too saline to farm. White crusts formed on the surface. Crops withered and died. Civilizations that had thrived for thousands of years found their agricultural base crumbling, their soil, their foundation, turning against them. The Greeks and Romans understood soil fertility to some degree. They practiced crop rotation, alternating wheat with legumes. Though they did not understand the chemistry of nitrogen fixation, they observed that fields planted with beans or lentils seemed refreshed, ready to produce good wheat harvests the following year. They also used manure, recognizing that animal waste improved soil. They wrote treatises on agriculture, on the best practices for maintaining productive land, but they too exhausted soils. The Roman Empire's expansion was partly a quest for new agricultural land, for fresh soils to replace those depleted around the Mediterranean, North Africa. Once the breadbasket of Rome gradually degraded, forests were cleared for timber and farmland, the soil exposed to sun and wind, without the anchoring roots of trees, without the organic matter from falling leaves. The soil eroded, washed away by winter rains, blown away by summer winds. What had been productive land became progressively more barren. In China, in the river valleys where civilization had flourished for thousands of years, farmers developed sophisticated understandings of soil management. They composted everything: plant waste, animal manure, even human waste, carefully rotted and returned to the fields. They built terraces on hillsides, preventing erosion, conserving both soil and water. They practiced intensive cultivation, supporting large populations on relatively small areas of land, but maintaining fertility through meticulous recycling of nutrients. Yet even there, the pressure of population sometimes overwhelmed sustainable practices. Hillsides were cleared too extensively, soils washed away. Rivers ran thick with sediment during storms, carrying away the topsoil, depositing it in deltas or carrying it out to sea, lost forever to agriculture. The European Middle Ages saw different patterns. After the fall of Rome, populations declined, agricultural pressure on the land decreased, forests regrew, fields were abandoned and returned to nature. The soil had time to recover, to rebuild its organic matter, to restabilize its structure. When agriculture intensified again, the soil had regained much of its fertility, but the knowledge of the Romans had been largely lost. Farmers worked through trial and error. through tradition, through practices passed down without full understanding of why they worked, the introduction of the heavy plow with its iron blade capable of turning the thick sods of northern Europe allowed cultivation of previously unworkable lands, but it also exposed soil to erosion, broke up the structure created by perennial grasses. The three-field system, rotating crops and leaving one field fallow each year, helped maintain fertility, gave the soil time to recover between plantings, but yields remained modest by modern standards, and famines were common when weather was unfavorable or when plant diseases struck. Then came a period of global exchange, of colonization and movement of crops and people across continents. European colonizers encountered soils very different from those they knew. In the Americas, in tropical regions, they found soils that seemed poor, thin red clays, low in nutrients, yet these soils supported complex indigenous agriculture. The native peoples had learned to work with what they had, creating raised beds, using biochar, practicing polyculture, growing multiple crops together in patterns that mimicked natural diversity. But the colonizers often ignored these practices. They imposed European methods, clearing forests for single crop plantations. The tropical soils evolved under constant cover of vegetation, degraded rapidly when exposed. The heavy rains leached nutrients, eroded the thin topsoil. Within years, productive land became exhausted. The response was often to clear more forest, to move on to fresh soil, leaving degraded land behind. In North America, European settlers encountered the prairies, grasslands extending beyond the horizon. The soil there was extraordinary, deep and black and rich, accumulated over thousands of years under perennial grasses with their dense root systems. The early farmers broke this prairie with iron plows, turned under the sod, planted wheat and corn. The yields were astounding. The soil seemed inexhaustible, so deep, so fertile. But it was not inexhaustible. The organic matter that had taken millennia to accumulate began to decline. Exposed to air and cultivation, it decomposed rapidly. The soil structure, created by roots and fungi and earthworms, was disrupted with each plowing. The fine particles, no longer bound into stable aggregates, became vulnerable to wind and water. And when drought came in the 1930s, when the rains failed and the winds blew, the soil lifted. Dust storms darkened the sky. Topsoil from Kansas and Oklahoma fell as rain in the Atlantic. Farms were buried, abandoned. The Dust Bowl was not just a weather event. It was a soil catastrophe, the consequence of treating soil as an inexhaustible resource rather than a living system requiring care. That crisis prompted changes. Governments promoted soil conservation. Farmers learned to practice contour plowing, to plant windbreaks, to maintain some vegetation cover. The understanding grew that soil was not merely dirt, not just a substrate for holding plants upright, but something complex and precious and vulnerable. Meanwhile, science was beginning to truly understand soil. The microscope revealed the teeming life within. The chemistry of nutrients was unraveled. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the essential elements, how they moved through ecosystems, how plants acquired them, how they could be depleted, the discovery that nitrogen could be synthesized industrially, converted from atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia through chemistry, seemed to promise freedom from the constraints of natural fertility. Fertilizers could be manufactured, applied to fields. Yields increased dramatically, and they did increase. In the decades after World War II, agricultural productivity soared. The Green Revolution, with its high-yielding crop varieties, its irrigation, its chemical fertilizers and pesticides, allowed population growth unprecedented in human history. Billions of people were fed from land that previously could not have supported them. Famine, while not eliminated, became less common, less catastrophic. But again, there were costs. The heavy use of fertilizers changed soil chemistry. Some nutrients became superabundant while others remained scarce. The balance was disrupted. Soil organisms, adapted to nutrient-poor conditions, to careful recycling, found their environment transformed. Some thrived, others declined. The diversity decreased, and the excess fertilizer, more than plants could absorb, leached away, running into streams and rivers, causing algal blooms. Dead zones in coastal waters where oxygen was depleted. The intensive tillage, the constant disturbance of soil for planting and weed control, continued to degrade structure. Erosion continued, even accelerated in some regions. Measurements showed that soil was being lost faster than it was forming, that the resource was being drawn down, spent. The question arose, how long can this continue? How much soil remains to be lost before agricultural productivity collapses? And there was another realization emerging, that soil is not just important for agriculture, not just a resource for producing food, but plays crucial roles in global systems. Soil stores carbon, enormous amounts of it, more carbon than all the vegetation and the atmosphere combined. As soils degrade, as their organic matter decomposes, that carbon is released, adding to atmospheric carbon dioxide, contributing to climate change, and conversely, healthy soils, well-managed soils with increasing organic matter can sequester carbon, pull it from the atmosphere, store it underground. The way humanity manages soil affects not just food production, but the climate itself, the habitability of the planet. I sit here in this field, touching this soil, and I understand that I am touching history, deep history written in minerals and organic matter, and recent history written in the choices humans have made, in how we have used and sometimes abused this living system. The soil beneath my fingers has fed people, has grown the crops that became bread, that sustained life, generation after generation. And it continues, still living, still functioning, still performing its countless invisible processes. But it is also changed, different from what it would have been without human intervention, perhaps shallower, perhaps less diverse in its microbial communities, perhaps more compacted, more eroded, and yet resilient too, capable of recovery if given the chance, if managed with understanding and care. The light has nearly gone now, and the field around me is settling into quietness, into that particular hush that comes when day releases its hold and something gentler takes over. I remain here, my hands still touching the soil, and I find myself thinking not about what has been, but about what is happening right now, in this moment, beneath the surface, somewhere below me, perhaps only centimeters down. A bacterial cell is dividing, splitting into two identical daughters, each carrying forward the same genetic instructions, the same metabolic pathways. This happens millions of times each second in the soil around me. An explosion of reproduction so vast it defies comprehension. And yet each division is precise, controlled, elegant in its molecular choreography, Nearby, a fungal hypha is extending, pushing forward one microscopic increment at a time, secreting enzymes ahead of itself, dissolving the barriers, absorbing the nutrients released, building new cell wall material and cytoplasm, expanding its reach. In the darkness of the soil, it grows toward gradients, toward food, toward plant roots that might become partners. Its direction is not random but guided, sensing chemical signals, following invisible maps written in concentration gradients. An earthworm contracts its muscles, pushing forward through a channel it has traversed many times before. The soil particles press against its mucus-covered skin. The friction is managed, controlled. The worm pauses, ingests a mouthful of soil and organic matter, grinds it in its muscular gizzard, begins the process of extraction and transformation that will end with castings deposited behind it, richer than what was consumed. A root tip pushes downward, following gravity, following moisture. The cells at the very tip divide rapidly, protected by a root cap that takes the damage of pushing through soil. Behind the tip, cells elongate, the root lengthening, and along its surface, root hairs emerge, delicate extensions that increase surface area 1,000-fold, reaching into the smallest pores, accessing water and dissolved nutrients. Each root hair lives only days, but new ones constantly form, maintaining the interface between plant and soil. I think about the exchanges happening at these root surfaces. Plants release up to 40% of the carbon they fix through photosynthesis into the soil through their roots. It seems wasteful, extravagant, but it is anything but. These exudates, these sugars and organic acids and proteins, feed the rhizosphere community, stimulating the bacteria and fungi that in turn provide services to the plant, breaking down organic matter, releasing nutrients, protecting against pathogens. The plant is farming its own support system, cultivating the microbial community it needs, and the mycorrhizal fungi connected to these roots are at this moment transporting resources. Phosphorus absorbed far from the plant moves through the hyphae molecule by molecule. A gradient is maintained, lower concentration near the root, higher in the soil solution, and the difference drives diffusion speed, pulls the nutrient toward where it is needed. In return, sugars move from plant to fungus, feeding the network, maintaining the partnership. Water is moving too, always moving, pulled upward by the transpiration of plants, by evaporation from the soil surface, drawn downward by gravity, by the pull of dry soil below. It flows through the largest pores quickly, draining away after rain, and clings in thin films around particles, held by surface tension, by the attraction between water molecules and mineral surfaces. Plants and microorganisms draw on these films, extracting water even from small pores where capillary forces hold it tightly. Gases diffuse through the pore spaces, oxygen from the atmosphere moving inward, consumed by the respiration of roots and soil organisms, carbon dioxide produced by that respiration moving outward. The concentrations in soil air are different from atmospheric air, lower in oxygen, higher in carbon dioxide, reflecting the balance between diffusion and biological activity. When soil becomes waterlogged, when pores fill with water, this gas exchange is blocked, oxygen levels plummet, and the whole community must adapt or perish. I consider the patience required for soil formation, for accumulation. A single centimeter of topsoil might take 500 years to form under natural conditions, perhaps longer, perhaps shorter, depending on climate and parent material and biological activity. But however long it takes, it is slow compared to human lifetimes, slow compared to the processes that can destroy it. A single storm can wash away soil that took centuries to form. A few years of improper cultivation can deplete organic matter that accumulated over millennia. And yet soil is not fragile in the way glass is fragile. It does not shatter irreversibly. It can recover, can rebuild, if given time and appropriate conditions. Abandoned agricultural land, left alone, begins to revegetate. Grasses colonize first, their roots binding the soil, adding organic matter, then shrubs, then eventually trees. The succession progresses, and with each stage the soil changes, deepens, enriches. Life creates the conditions for more life. The process is self-amplifying, self-organizing, moving toward complexity and stability. There are places where this recovery has been documented. Fields abandoned during the Great Depression, left untouched for decades, have rebuilt soil structure, accumulated organic matter, regained much of what was lost. Not to the original prairie state, perhaps, not in mere decades, but moving in that direction, healing, the knowledge that recovery is possible, that damage is not always permanent, offers something important. Not an excuse for carelessness, but hope that restoration is achievable. I think about the future of soil, about the choices that lie ahead. The human population continues to grow. The demand for food increases. The pressure on agricultural land intensifies. Climate change brings new uncertainties, altered rainfall patterns, more frequent droughts and floods, temperature extremes that stress both crops and soil organisms. The challenges are real and mounting, but there is also growing understanding, new practices emerging, farmers experimenting with no-till agriculture, leaving soil undisturbed, planting directly into residue from previous crops, maintaining structure, preventing erosion, reducing the oxidation of organic matter, cover crops planted between cash crops, keeping living roots in the soil year-round, feeding the soil community, capturing nutrients that might otherwise leach away, adding organic matter when tilled in, composting on a large scale, returning organic waste to agricultural land, closing nutrient loops that have been broken, precision agriculture, using technology to apply fertilizers only where needed in amounts matched to crop requirements, reducing excess, minimizing environmental damage, agroforestry, integrating trees with crops or livestock, creating more complex systems that better mimic natural ecosystems that build soil while producing food. These approaches are not widely adopted yet. They require changes in practice, sometimes changes in equipment or market structures, but they demonstrate that different futures are possible, that agriculture and soil health need not be in opposition, that we can produce food while maintaining or even enhancing the living system that makes production possible. The darkness is nearly complete now. The field has become a study in shadows, shapes barely distinguishable. I can no longer see the soil clearly, but I can feel it, cool against my palms, slightly damp, textured, and I understand that my inability to see it does not mean nothing is happening. The darkness is when much of the soil community is most active, when the heat of day has passed, when moisture persists. The processes continue, indifferent to light or dark, ongoing and essential. I rise slowly, my joints stiff from kneeling, and I stand looking out over the field, thinking about the thin layer of soil covering the planet's surface, thin relative to the Earth's radius, averaging perhaps a meter deep, sometimes less, occasionally more. This thin film is what stands between humanity and starvation, what filters our water, what cycles our nutrients, what stores our carbon. It is easy to overlook, to take for granted, to treat as mere dirt, but it is none of those things. It is alive. It is complex beyond our full understanding, despite centuries of study. It is essential in ways we are still discovering, and it is vulnerable, capable of degradation, of loss, of becoming less than it was. The choices we make, collectively and individually, about how we treat soil will determine not just agricultural productivity, but the functioning of global ecosystems, the stability of the climate, the possibilities available to future generations. The wind moves across the field, carrying scents I cannot quite identify, organic and mineral, present and ancient. I think about all the organisms in the soil beneath me preparing for night, the ones that will become more active and those that will rest, the constant cycling of energy and matter, the exchange between living and non-living, between past and future. And I think about the people who have stood in fields like this throughout history, who noticed the soil, who wondered about it, who learned through trial and error what helped it and what harmed it, who passed that knowledge forward, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, each generation inheriting soil changed by those before, each generation making choices that will affect those after. I am part of that lineage, standing here in this moment, connected backward through time to the first farmers noticing that seeds grew better in certain soils, and forward to people not yet born who will stand in fields and touch soil shaped by what we do now. The responsibility is sobering, but it is also grounding. It places me in a context larger than myself, part of a story still being written. The field is quiet. The soil rests beneath my feet, alive and ancient and ongoing. I can no longer see the individual particles, the subtle variations in color, but I know they are there. I know the processes continue, unseen but real. The bacteria dividing, the fungi growing, the earthworms burrowing, the roots reaching, all of it happening in the darkness, in the silence, patient and persistent, and standing here, feeling the soil beneath me, I understand something fundamental, that I am not separate from this system, not an observer outside looking in. I am made of elements that were once in this soil, that cycled through plants and animals before becoming part of me, and will return to soil when I am gone. The boundary between self and soil is temporary, permeable, illusory in the long view. The last light fades from the western sky. Stars are beginning to appear, distant and cold and beautiful, and beneath them, beneath my feet, the soil continues its quiet work, building and breaking down, cycling and storing, supporting the vast community of life that depends upon it. I take one last handful, let it fall slowly through my fingers, feeling its texture, its slight moisture, its particular character. Then I brush my hands clean, or nearly clean. Some soil remains in the creases of my palms, and I do not mind. I carry it with me, a small connection, a reminder of the living earth beneath all our feet, patient, essential and worthy of our wonder and our care. There is something about the way a cat moves through a room, the way it pauses in a shaft of moonlight, the way it settles into a space as if claiming what has always been its own, that speaks to a story much older than we might imagine. Tonight, I find myself thinking about these creatures, these elegant companions who share our homes and our lives with such quiet authority, and I wonder how it came to be this way, how these independent beings, these hunters and wanderers, came to rest beside our hearths and curl into our laps. The story begins not in the living rooms and kitchens of today, but in a world that seems almost dreamlike in its distance from us, a world of dust and sun and endless golden grain. If I close my eyes, I can almost see it, the landscape of the ancient Near East, some 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, where the great river valleys cradled the first stirrings of what we might call civilization. The Fertile Crescent, they call it, that arc of a land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and down along the Mediterranean, where humans first gathered the wild grasses and began to to cultivate them, to transform wandering into settling, and in those settlements, in those first permanent villages built of mud, brick, and stone, something remarkable was happening. Grain was being stored, harvested wheat and barley piled in granaries, creating abundance, creating surplus, creating something that had never existed before in quite this way. But abundance draws more than grateful humans. It draws smaller creatures too, mice and rats who found in these stores of grain a paradise beyond imagining, and the granaries became their kingdoms, their feast halls, unless something else arrived. Imagine those early villages at dusk, the air cooling after the fierce heat of day, smoke rising from cooking fires, the sounds of children and dogs, and the low voices of people settling in for the evening, and there, at the edge of the firelight, moving like liquid shadow, a small form, tawny and striped, eyes catching the glow, the wild cat, Felis silvestris libica, the African wildcat, slipping between the buildings, drawn not by the humans themselves, but by the abundance of prey that the humans had inadvertently created. These cats were hunters, solitary and wary, keeping to themselves in the scrublands and deserts. But here was opportunity. Here was an endless supply of the very creatures they had evolved to catch, and so they came. Generation after generation, not tamed, not domesticated, not yet, but tolerated, the humans who might have chased away other predators, who might have seen them as threats or competitors, instead watched these small hunters with something like appreciation, because the cats were solving a problem, keeping the grain stores safe, protecting the harvest that meant survival. This was not domestication as we might imagine it. No one was reaching out to pet these wild hunters. No one was offering them scraps or inviting them inside. This was something more subtle, a kind of mutual tolerance, a recognition of benefit. The cats hunted. The humans allowed them to hunt. And slowly, so slowly, across hundreds of years, the distance between them began to close. There must have been individual cats, particular animals, who were less fearful than others, whose temperaments were naturally more bold, more curious, who ventured closer to the humans, who perhaps even learned to associate the presence of people with the presence of prey. And these cats, these slightly bolder individuals, they survived, they thrived, they pass their genes on to their kittens. And there must have been individual humans, particular farmers or storekeepers or children, who looked at these small hunters with fascination rather than fear, who began to notice their patterns, their habits, who perhaps left out scraps intentionally, or who simply moved more gently, more quietly, allowing the cats to remain nearby. Generation by generation, grain season after grain season, the relationship shifted, deepened, transformed. The cats who could tolerate human presence had better access to prey. The humans who tolerated cats had cleaner grain stores, and somewhere in that exchange, in that slow dance of mutual benefit, domestication began its quiet work, not through cages or leashes, not through force or capture, but through the simple arithmetic of survival and advantage. The cats were choosing this proximity as much as the humans were choosing to allow it. And in that choice, in that mutual selection, something new was being born into the world, a partnership, however loose and undefined, between two species who each saw in the other not an enemy, not quite a friend, but a useful presence, a beneficial neighbor in the long work of a living. And so the stage was set in those ancient villages, under those ancient stars, for a relationship that would span millennia, that would cross continents, that would transform both species in ways neither could have anticipated, as the wild hunters began their slow, almost imperceptible journey toward the windowsills and armchairs of the modern world. The archaeological record, when we learn to read it, speaks in whispers rather than declarations. It offers us fragments, pieces of bone and pottery, burial sites and refuse heaps. And from these remnants we must reconstruct entire worlds. On the island of Cyprus, in a place called Shilourokambos, archaeologists found something remarkable, a grave, dated to approximately 7,500 years before the present. And in that grave, buried with care alongside a human body, was a cat. Not just any arrangement, not the accidental inclusion of remains, but a deliberate placement. The cat had been laid to rest mere inches from the human, in a position that suggests intention, relationship, perhaps even affection. And this discovery tells us something profound, because Cyprus is an island and cats are not native to islands. Someone brought that cat across the water. Someone carried it on a boat, valued it enough to transport it, to keep it, to eventually bury it with ceremony. This was no wild creature wandering through. This was a companion. This was a relationship that had already formed, already deepened, already become something worth preserving even in death. And if cats were being transported to islands 7,500 years ago, then the relationship must have been developing for centuries before that, millennia perhaps, in those grain villages of the Fertile Crescent, in the slow accumulation of trust and proximity, the genetic studies, when scientists began to analyze the DNA of modern house cats and compare it to their wild relatives, painted a picture of origins. They found that all domestic cats, every tabby and calico and Siamese, trace their lineage back to that same source. Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat, still prowling the deserts and scrublands of the Middle East and North Africa. But the genetics revealed something else too, something fascinating about the nature of the cat domestication. Unlike dogs, who show dramatic physical differences from their wolf ancestors, cats change very little. The skull shape, the body size. The basic architecture of the feline form remained remarkably stable. What changed was not so much the cat's body, but its behavior, its willingness to be near, its tolerance, its temperament. This tells us that humans were not actively breeding cats for specific traits the way they bred dogs for hunting or herding or guarding. The cats were largely selecting themselves, the ones who could abide human presence, who could adapt to the noise and activity of settlements, who could raise their kittens in the margins of human spaces. Those were the ones who prospered, who multiplied, who passed on their slightly more tolerant, slightly more flexible natures. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, in the archaeological layers of sites like Jarmo and Jericho, we find evidence of cats among the ruins, not as rarities but as regular presences. Their bones appear in the refuse, suggesting they were part of the daily fabric of life, hunting the mice and rats, living alongside the humans, not quite wild, not quite tame, existing in that liminal space between two worlds. And then, if we follow the timeline forward, if we trace the spread of agriculture and settlement, we come to Egypt, and here the story transforms, deepens, becomes something richer and stranger. Egypt, with its great river, the Nile, bringing life to the desert, creating a ribbon of fertility where grain could grow in abundance, where granaries could be filled to overflowing, where the need for cats as protectors of food stores became not just useful but essential. Egypt, where cats would become not merely tolerated, not merely useful, but sacred. The ancient Egyptians, in their sophisticated understanding of the world, saw in the cat something divine. The goddess Bastet, originally depicted as a fierce lioness, gradually transformed in the artistic record into a more domestic form, a cat-headed woman, graceful and protective, associated with home and fertility, with music and dance, with joy and protection. Cats in Egypt were not simply animals. They were living representations of divine power. They were protectors not just of grain, but of households, of children, of the domestic sphere itself. And the Egyptians treated them accordingly, with reverence, with care, with laws that protected them from harm. To kill a cat in ancient Egypt, even accidentally, could bring severe punishment, death in some cases. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, recorded his observations of Egyptian cat worship with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment. He described how Egyptians would shave their eyebrows in mourning when a household cat died, how they would carry the body to special burial sites, how they would mummify these creatures with the same care given to human dead. And the mummies themselves, thousands upon thousands of cat mummies, have been discovered in Egypt, small wrapped forms, some containing kittens, some adult cats, preserved for eternity. Many were offerings to Bastet, devotional objects, ways of seeking favor from the goddess, but others, buried in household contexts, seemed to be individual pets, specific animals who were loved and mourned and remembered. The art of ancient Egypt shows us cats everywhere. Tomb paintings depict them sitting beneath chairs, collared and decorated, clearly domesticated, clearly valued. Some images show them on hunting expeditions, trained to retrieve birds, working alongside their human companions in the marshes. Other images show them simply as part of daily life, eating fish, playing, existing in the comfortable spaces of home. One famous image from the tomb of Nebamun, a scribe and official, shows a hunting scene, and there, leaping with impossible grace, is a cat catching birds in mid-flight, its body twisted in that characteristic feline flexibility. This cat wears a collar. This cat is doing work for its human, but the artist has captured something more than mere utility. There is beauty here, admiration, perhaps even affection in the careful rendering of the animal's form. The Egyptians bred cats, selectively choosing for temperament and appearance, creating varieties, color patterns, the spotted tabby, the mackerel tabby. The solid colors all began to appear with more frequency, more definition, and while the cats remained physically similar to their wild ancestors, the behavioral distance grew wider. These were animals who sought human company, who lived entirely within human spaces, who had forgotten or never learned the full wildness of their heritage. And from Egypt, the cats began to spread, not through their own wandering, though cats are certainly capable of that, but through human agency, through trade routes and military campaigns, through the slow expansion of civilizations. Phoenician traders sailing the Mediterranean coup, carrying goods from port to port, brought cats aboard their ships, practical measures against the rats that could ruin cargo, but also, perhaps, companions in the long, lonely stretches of sea travel. And when those ships made port in Greece, in Rome, in the far reaches of the Mediterranean world, some cats went ashore, some cats stayed, and new populations established themselves in new lands. The Romans, ever practical, valued cats for the same reasons the early farmers had: pest control, protection of food stores, but they also, in their way, appreciated them as creatures of comfort. Images from Pompeii, that city frozen in volcanic ash, show cats in domestic contexts, mosaics, depicting them with extraordinary detail and care. These were not wild animals feared or merely tolerated. These were household members. A mosaic from the House of the Faun in Pompeii shows a cat catching a bird, the scene rendered with such skill that we can almost see the tension in the cat's muscles, the focus in its eyes, the moment of the hunt, captured forever in tiny tiles of colored stone. Someone commissioned this. Someone wanted this image in their home, wanted to see that feline grace and power every day. In Greece, cats appear in the artistic records somewhat later than in Egypt. But when they do appear, they are shown with similar familiarity, similar integration into daily life. Vase paintings, sculptures, literary references all suggest that by the classical period, cats had become unremarkable in their presence, common enough to need no explanation, simply part of the texture of civilized life. But the spread was not uniform, was not simple. In some places, cats arrived early, in others much later. The island of Britain, for instance, seems to have received its first domestic cats during the Roman occupation, sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era. Before that, the people of Britain had no cats, relied on other methods, other animals, or simply accepted losses to rodents as inevitable. And in each new place, each new climate and culture, the cats adapted, interbred sometimes with local wild cat populations where they existed, creating new genetic mixtures, new patterns, but always maintaining that core identity, that essential catness that had first drawn humans to tolerate their presence in the granaries of the Fertile Crescent. The behavioral relationship that delicate balance of independence and affection that characterizes the house cat was already established by this early period. Cats were not pack animals like dogs, did not form hierarchical relationships with humans as leaders or alphas. Instead, they remained fundamentally solitary in their social structure, willing to coexist, willing to accept food and shelter, willing even to show affection, but always on their own terms, always retaining that core of self-determination. This must have been part of their appeal, this combination of beauty and utility, of warmth and wildness. They could be companions without being servile, could be useful without being dependent, could share a home while remaining somehow apart, mysterious, other. The ancient writers, when they mentioned cats, often noted this quality, this sense of the cat as a creature that chooses to stay rather than being compelled to serve. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century, described cats as loving their homes more than their humans, an observation that anyone who has owned a cat might recognize. That sense that the cat has decided to grace you with its presence, has chosen this arrangement and might unchoose it at any moment. And yet, despite this independence, despite this retention of wildness, the bond was real. The evidence of mourning, of deliberate burial, of artistic celebration, all suggest that humans had come to love these creatures, not just value them, not just use them, but genuinely care for them as individuals, as personalities, as beings worthy of affection and memory. By the time the first millennium of the Common Era was well underway, cats had spread throughout the Mediterranean world, into Europe, into Asia, along the trade routes. Each migration carried with it not just the physical animal, but the complex relationship that had been developing for thousands of years, the understanding that cats could be both wild and domestic, both useful and companionable, both independent and affectionate. The foundation had been laid in those ancient grain stores, in those Egyptian temples, in those Roman households, for a relationship that would continue to evolve, to deepen, to spread, until cats would become one of the most successful domesticated species on Earth, living on every continent in nearly every human settlement, choosing, always choosing, to remain. The medieval world, that 1,000-year span stretching from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, was a complicated time for cats, a time when the relationship that had been building for millennia would be tested, twisted, darkened, and yet somehow endure. In the monasteries of Europe, those islands of learning and literacy in a largely illiterate world, cats were valued, welcomed even. The monks who spent their days copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge in careful script on vellum pages, understood the threat that mice posed to their precious books. A single mouse could destroy months of painstaking work, could gnaw through irreplaceable texts. And so cats walked the cloisters, slept in the scriptoriums where we were fed and sheltered and appreciated. There exists a manuscript from the 9th century, an Irish text, where a monk has written a small poem in the margin, a brief verse about his cat. Pangur ban, white pangur. The monk compares his own work of hunting for meaning in texts to the cat's work of hunting mice. Each of us, he writes, has his own art, and the verse is tender, affectionate, the words of someone who sees the cat not as mere tool, but as companion, as fellow worker in the quiet hours. But beyond the monastery walls, the relationship was becoming more fraught, more complex. The Christian church in medieval Europe had an ambivalent relationship with animals in general, and cats, with their nocturnal habits, their independence, their inscrutable expressions, began to attract suspicion. Cats were associated with women, with the domestic sphere, with a certain kind of knowledge that existed outside official channels, the village wise woman. The healer who knew herbs and simples often kept cats, and as the church began to see witchcraft everywhere, as paranoia about heresy and devil worship grew, cats became entangled in those fears. The black cat especially, with its dark fur seeming to absorb light, became a symbol of evil in some quarters. Associated with witches and demons, with the devil himself, it was said that witches could transform into cats, that Satan appeared as a black cat, that cats were familiars, demonic servants given to those who had made pacts with dark powers, and so began a period of persecution in some parts of Europe, particularly during the height of witch-hunting hysteria from the 13th to the 17th centuries. Cats were killed in large numbers, thrown from towers, burned in bonfires, tortured as proxies for their supposed witch companions. Whole populations were decimated. The consequences of this mass killing were grimly ironic. With fewer cats to control rodent populations, rats multiplied, thrived, spread, and rats carried fleas, and fleas carried plague. The Black Death that swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing perhaps a third of the population, was spread by rats, by the very creatures that cats had been controlling for thousands of years. Some historians suggest that the persecution of cats contributed to the severity of the plague, that the loss of natural predators allowed rat populations to explode, created conditions where disease could spread more easily. Whether this is true or not, the correlation is striking, haunting, a reminder that the systems we disturb, the relationships we break, often have consequences we cannot foresee. But even during this dark period, even as some cats were being killed out of superstition and fear, others were living quiet lives in barns and kitchens, hunting mice, bearing kittens, carrying on the ancient compact. The persecution was real but not universal, not constant. Many people, perhaps most people, still valued their cats, still understood their usefulness, still felt affection for these small hunters who asked so little and gave so much, and on ships, cats remained indispensable. Every vessel that put to sea, every merchant ship and naval frigate and exploration vessel carried cats to control the rats that inevitably infested the holds. Sailors were notoriously superstitious, but their superstitions about cats were generally positive. A ship's cat was good luck, protective, essential, and these seafaring cats, traveling in the hulls of ships from Bristol to Bombay, from Lisbon to the New World, spread feline populations to every corner of the globe. When European ships reached the Americas, cats went with them, establishing populations in places that had never known them. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no domestic cats, had developed their own relationships with other animals, but cats, arriving with the colonizers, adapted quickly, found new prey, new climates, new niches to fill. In the Islamic world, the relationship with cats had remained largely positive throughout the medieval period. The Prophet Muhammad, according to tradition, loved cats. One famous story tells of how he cut off the sleeve of his robe rather than disturb his cat Muezza, who was sleeping on it. Another tells of a cat who saved the prophet from a poisonous snake and was blessed with the ability to always land on its feet. This cultural appreciation meant that in the Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, cats were welcomed in mosques and homes, were fed and cared for, were seen as clean animals, ritually pure, suitable for the company of the faithful. Cities in the Middle East and North Africa developed large populations of free-roaming cats, fed by the community, living in the streets and alleyways, neither fully wild nor fully owned, existing in that characteristic feline space between worlds. In Asia, cats had arrived along the trade routes, the Silk Road bringing not just spices and silk, but animals and ideas. In China, cats appear in the historical record from around 2,000 years ago, valued for pest control in the granaries and silk stores. In Japan, cats arrived from China and Korea, and by the medieval period, the Heian period, they were being kept by the aristocracy, pampered and decorated, subjects of art and poetry. Japanese cats were often kept indoors, especially valuable breeding females, protected and prized, and the Japanese artistic tradition, with its attention to natural detail, its love of asymmetry and imperfection, found endless inspiration in feline forms. Cats appear in scrolls and screens, in woodblock prints, sometimes realistic, sometimes fantastical, transformed into supernatural beings, bakaneko, cats with magical powers. But even these supernatural cats were not necessarily evil. They were complex, tricksters, shapeshifters, reflecting the real cat's ability to seem domesticated one moment and utterly wild the next. The working relationship, cats as controllers of vermin, remained central throughout all of this, in the granaries of medieval Europe and Asia, in the warehouses of port cities, in the holds of ships, in the storage rooms of great houses. Cats did the work they had been doing for thousands of years, hunting, killing, protecting human food stores from the creatures that would consume them, but they also, increasingly, served another function, one that had always been there, but was becoming more pronounced, more acknowledged. They provided comfort, companionship, the pleasure of their presence, the softness of fur underhand, the rumbling vibration of purring, the grace of their movements, the mystery of their moods. All of this became valued not for utility, but for its own sake. Wealthy households, those who could afford to feed animals who did no work, began to keep cats purely as pets. Breeding programs, informal at first, began to select for certain traits, certain colors, certain temperaments. The cats of Siam, now Thailand, developed distinctive pointed coloration and blue eyes. The cats of Persia developed long flowing coats. The cats of the Isle of Man developed a genetic mutation that shortened or eliminated their tails. These breeds were not yet standardized, not yet formalized into the rigid categories that would come later. But the diversity was increasing. The appearance of cats was changing through human selection for the first time since domestication began. And this suggested a shift in the relationship. Cats were no longer just tolerated hunters, just useful workers. They were becoming aesthetic objects, status symbols, companions chosen for their beauty as much as their utility. Yet even as breeding began, even as some cats lived lives of luxury in noble households, the vast majority of cats remained working animals, living semi-feral lives in barns and alleys, breeding freely, maintaining the genetic diversity and vigor that would serve the species well. These cats, the common cats, the mixed-breed mousers, were the true inheritors of the ancient compact, still hunting, still choosing to live near humans for the abundance it provided, still raising their kittens in the margins of human civilization. The folklore and superstition surrounding cats grew richer and stranger during this period. In Celtic land, cats were associated with the fairy realm, the other world, mysterious, magical, not quite to be trusted. In Slavic countries, certain markings were thought to bring luck or ward off evil. In Scandinavia, the goddess Freya was said to ride in a chariot pulled by cats, massive cats, powerful enough to draw a divine being. These stories, these beliefs, reflected the cat's liminal nature, the way it existed between wild and tame, between useful and ornamental, between mundane and mysterious. A cat sleeping by the fire was as familiar as bread, but a cat's eyes glowing in darkness, a cat's eerie yowl in the night, these were things that spoke to older fears, older knowings, reminded humans that this creature, however domesticated it seemed, retained something of the wild, the medieval agricultural calendar, the rhythm of seasons and harvests, structured the cat's role. In summer, when grain was harvested and stored, cats were essential, their population allowed to expand to meet the need. In winter, when food was scarce for everyone, fewer cats survived. Natural selection culling the populations. Those who were particularly good hunters, particularly bold in scrounging, particularly favored by humans who would share scraps, those were the ones who made it through to spring. This yearly cycle, repeated across centuries, shaped the cat population, kept them adapted to their role, prevented them from becoming too domesticated, too dependent. They needed to be able to hunt, to survive on their own if necessary, because winter did not care about human sentiment, only about survival. And yet, even in this harsh world, even in times of scarcity and superstition, the bond persisted. People named their cats, mourned them when they died, told stories about particular animals with particular personalities. The historical record, sparse as it is for the lives of common people, still contains glimpses of this affection, wills that mention cats, court records of disputes over cat ownership, small markers of lives lived together. The medieval world was transforming, slowly, imperceptibly from within, moving toward something new, and cats, adapting as they had always adapted, were moving with it, their populations spreading, their genetics diversifying, their relationship with humans deepening in some ways and remaining anciently constant in others, neither fully wild nor fully tame, neither servant nor master, simply present, simply there, sharing the human world while remaining fundamentally themselves. The Renaissance, that flowering of art and learning and rediscovery, brought with it a new way of seeing the world, a new curiosity about natural things. Artists began to observe cats with the same attention they gave to human anatomy, to the play of light on fabric, to the perfect rendering of reality. Leonardo da Vinci filled pages of his notebooks with cat sketches, quick studies of cats stretching, playing, fighting, sleeping. His hand captured the essential catness of these creatures, the way their spines curved, the alertness in their ears, the relaxed power in their limbs. He was not just drawing cats. He was studying them, trying to understand the mechanics of their movement, the architecture of their grace. And in paintings of the period, cats began to appear with increasing frequency, sometimes symbolically, representing domesticity or independence or mystery, but often simply as part of the scene, part of the texture of daily life. A cat in the corner of a domestic interior, a cat sleeping on a windowsill in a portrait. These were not statements about cats, but acknowledgments of their presence, their ordinariness, their integration into human spaces. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, allowed for the spread of knowledge in ways previously unimaginable. Books about natural history began to appear, catalogs of animals, descriptions of their habits and natures, and cats were included, discussed, categorized. Though the understanding was often mixed with folklore and error, still it represented an attempt to know them, to understand them through observation rather than superstition. The age of exploration, those centuries when European ships crossed every ocean, mapped every coast, brought cats to every corner of the globe, Australia, New Zealand, remote islands in the Pacific and Atlantic, all received populations of cats, sometimes deliberately introduced, sometimes escaping from ships, sometimes left behind when ships departed. In these new environments where cats often thrived, especially on islands where native species had evolved without mammalian predators. The ecological impact was sometimes catastrophic. Bird populations decimated, small mammals driven to extinction. The cat's hunting prowess, so valued in granaries and ships, became a destructive force when unleashed on ecosystems that had no evolutionary experience of such predators. This tension between the cat as useful companion and the cat as invasive predator would become increasingly apparent in later centuries. But in the age of exploration itself, the primary concern was practical. Ships needed cats, colonies needed cats, and cats, adaptable as ever, made themselves at home in climates from tropical to Arctic, in landscapes from desert to rainforest. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and classification, brought new attention to the diversity of cat breeds. Scientists like Carolus Linnaeus, who created the system of taxonomic classification still used today, gave the domestic cat its scientific name, Felis catus, distinguishing it from its wild relatives while acknowledging their kinship. And breeders, particularly in England, began to take a more systematic approach to creating distinct varieties. The concept of a breed, as we understand it today, a group of animals with standardized appearance and documented lineage, was developing, first with horses and dogs, but increasingly with cats as well. The Victorian era, that age of empire and industry and domestic refinement, transformed the human relationship with cats in profound ways. Queen Victoria herself kept cats, and what the Queen did, society followed. Cats became fashionable, desirable, objects of refined taste. The first formal cat show was held at the Crystal Palace in London in 1871, organized by Harrison Weir, an artist and cat enthusiast who wanted to elevate the status of cats through competition and standardization. Hundreds of cats were exhibited, judged on their conformity to breed standards, their beauty, their temperament, and thousands of people came to see them, to admire them, to marvel at the variety that could exist within a single species. This was a turning point. Cats were no longer just animals who happened to live with humans. They were becoming projects, subjects of deliberate creation. Their appearance was being shaped through selective breedings more intensively than ever before. Persian cats with their flat faces and flowing coats, Siamese cats with their distinctive points and blue eyes, British short hairs with their round faces and plush fur, Maine Coons with their size and tufted ears. All of these breeds were standardized, refined, promoted. The cat fancy, as it came to be called, spread from England to America and Europe. Cat clubs were formed, breed registries established, rules and standards written and debated. The cats themselves, once they had been street animals, barn animals, workers. Now some of them lived lives of extraordinary privilege, bred for show, pampered and groomed, worth substantial sums of money. But even as this fancy world developed, even as cats became status symbols and show animals, the majority of cats remained what they had always been: mousers and companions, mixed-breed animals living ordinary lives in ordinary homes. The genetic diversity of these common cats, their vigor and adaptability, remained the foundation on which the fancy breeds were built. The 19th century also brought new understanding of cats as biological organisms, the development of a veterinary medicine, the growing scientific study of animal behavior and physiology began to reveal the cat's true nature. They were obligate carnivores, requiring meat in their diet in ways that dogs, more omnivorous, did not. Their digestive systems, their metabolisms, their nutritional needs, all were distinct, specific, requiring understanding if cats were to thrive in captivity. The discovery of the role of cats in disease transmission, particularly toxoplasmosis, brought new concerns. Cats became subjects of public health discussions, their large populations in cities sometimes seen as problems to be managed. Yet their value in controlling rats and mice, particularly in warehouses and food storage facilities, remained undeniable. The relationship was being negotiated in new ways, through science and regulation, rather than folklore and tradition. The 20th century, that era of unprecedented change, brought cats fully into the modern world. Urbanization accelerated, and cats adapted. Cities filled with apartment buildings where outdoor space was limited, and cats, unlike dogs, could live contentedly indoors, could use litter boxes, could exercise through play rather than walks. This made them ideal urban pets, perfect companions for the modern working person living in small spaces. Commercial cat food appeared, first in the early 1900s, crude by modern standards but representing a shift. No longer did cats have to hunt or scavenge or rely on table scraps. They could be fed prepared food, formulated, eventually, with their specific nutritional needs in mind. This changed the practical nature of cat keeping, made it easier, more convenient, more accessible to people who lived far from barns and granaries. Veterinary care improved dramatically. Vaccines were developed for common feline diseases. Spaying and neutering became routine, extending cats' lives and preventing unwanted litters. The average lifespan of a pet cat increased from perhaps 5 or 6 years at the beginning of the century to 12 or 15 or even 20 years by its end. This meant deeper bonds, longer relationships, more investment in individual animals. The understanding of cat behavior also deepened. Scientists began to study how cats think, how they communicate, what their social structures look like. researchers discovered that cats have complex vocalizations, different meows for different purposes, developed specifically to communicate with humans. Their purr, once thought to signal only contentment, was found to also occur during stress or pain, possibly a self-soothing mechanism. Their body language, the position of ears and tail and whiskers, was decoded, catalogued, explained, and people began to understand that cats, while not pack animals, were not the solitary creatures they had been assumed to be. They formed social bonds with humans and with other cats. They could be trained, though their independence meant they were less motivated by pleasing humans than dogs were. They played throughout their lives, retaining kitten-like behaviors into adulthood, a sign of domestication, of neoteny, of perpetual youth. The late 20th century saw an explosion in the cat population of the developed world. In the United States alone, cat ownership surpassed dog ownership. Cats became the most popular pet, their numbers in the tens of millions. Their images filled the early internet, cat videos and photos becoming a defining feature of online culture. The bond between humans and cats, ancient as it was, found new expression in digital sharing, in the celebration of individual cats' personalities and quirks. Yet this population boom brought challenges. Feral cat colonies in cities, abandoned pets breeding freely, creating populations of cats living wild but dependent on human refuse, animal shelters filled with unwanted cats, millions euthanized every year because homes could not be found for them. The same adaptability that had made cats successful, their ability to survive and reproduce in human-altered landscapes, now created problems of overpopulation, and the ecological concerns, first recognized on islands centuries before, became more urgent. Studies showed the devastating impact of free-roaming cats on wildlife, particularly birds and small mammals. Even well-fed pet cats retained their hunting instinct, killed for sport rather than food. The tension between cat lovers and conservationists grew sharp, passionate, unresolved. The relationship had become complicated, layered, no longer the simple compact of the ancient granaries. Cats were beloved companions, family members, sources of comfort and joy. But they were also environmental concerns, public health considerations, subjects of legislation and debate. The intimacy had deepened even as the complications multiplied. And yet, through all of this, the essential nature of the cat remained, still independent, still mysterious, still balancing wildness and domesticity in that characteristic way. A cat sleeping in a sunbeam in a modern apartment, curled on a cushion in a climate-controlled room, fed from a bowl, wearing a collar, that cat retained something of its wild ancestors, something untamed, something that could never be fully possessed or controlled, only invited, only welcomed, only loved on its own terms. The story of domestication, when we really look at it, is not a story of conquest or submission. It is something stranger, more mutual, more mysterious. Think about what happened in those ancient grain stores. Neither species planned it. Neither species understood what was beginning. The cats came for the mice. The humans tolerated the cats. And in that simple exchange, that basic arithmetic of advantage, something profound began to unfold. Because what is domestication, really, if not a kind of dance, a negotiation between two forms of being? The wolf became the dog, through transformation, through change so deep that body and mind and behavior were all reshaped. But the cat came to us almost unchanged, slipped into our world while remaining fundamentally itself. This tells us something about the nature of the feline, about that quality of independence that defines them. They domesticated themselves, not through submission but through choice, through a kind of pragmatic opportunism that recognized benefit without surrendering autonomy. And perhaps this is why the bond feels different, why loving a cat is not like loving a dog. A dog gives itself completely, loves with abandon, with devotion, with a kind of wholehearted surrender. But a cat offers something more conditional, more measured, and somehow, in its very conditionality, more precious. When a cat chooses to sit with you, to purr against your hand, to sleep curled in your lap, it is choosing, in that moment, your company over solitude, your warmth over independence. And there is something deeply satisfying in being chosen, in being deemed worthy, in being granted access to that guarded affection. The purr itself, that strange vibration that arises from somewhere deep in the chest, is one of nature's mysteries. Scientists have studied it, measured its frequency, discovered that it falls in a range that may actually promote healing, that may strengthen bones, reduce pain, lower blood pressure. A cat purring on your chest might be offering more than comfort, might be offering something like medicine, ancient and wordless and true. And the eyes, those vertical pupils that expand in darkness, that contract to slits in bright light, giving cats their ability to see in conditions where humans are blind, those eyes that seem to look through you, past you, into some light realm we cannot access. They remind us that this creature, however domesticated, however familiar, perceives the world differently than we do, lives in a sensory landscape we can only imagine. Their hearing, detecting frequencies far above human range, means they exist in a world of sounds we never hear. Their sense of smell, their Jacobson's organ that lets them taste scent, opens dimensions of experience we lack. They are living in our homes, but in a different reality, a parallel world that overlaps with ours, but never quite aligns. And perhaps this is part of the fascination, the enduring mystery. We share our lives with these creatures, and yet can never fully know them, can never fully understand what it is to be them. They remain other, remain wild in some essential way, even as they sleep on our beds and eat from our hands. The scientists who study cat cognition have discovered remarkable things. Cats recognize their names. Though they may choose not to respond, they understand pointing, can follow human gaze, can learn to manipulate humans to get what they want. They are intelligent, but their intelligence is directed toward their own ends, not toward pleasing us, not toward obedience, but toward survival, toward comfort, toward the satisfaction of their own desires. This is not a lesser intelligence, just a different one, shaped by evolution for a solitary hunting lifestyle, for independence rather than cooperation. And when we learn to appreciate it on its own terms, to stop expecting cats to be like dogs, to accept them as they are, the relationship deepens, becomes richer, more real. The bond between cat and human, 10,000 years in the making, is built on this foundation of the mutual benefit and mutual respect. We provide food, shelter, safety, warmth. They provide pest control, companionship, comfort, beauty, but more than that, they provide a connection to something wild, something untamed, something that chose to stay but could choose to leave. In our modern world, so controlled, so domesticated, so cut off from nature, there is something deeply satisfying about living with an animal that bridges that gap, that brings a little wildness into our homes, that reminds us that not everything can be tamed, not everything should be. The cat on the windowsill, watching birds, tail twitching with predatory focus, is the same as the wild cat on the edge of that ancient village, the same hunting instinct, the same fierce concentration. Thousands of years have passed. Civilizations have risen and fallen. The world has transformed beyond recognition, but the cat remains essentially magnificently itself, and in that continuity, that connection to the deep past, there is something profound we are touching when we stroke a cat's fur. The same creature that Egyptian priests revered, that medieval monks sheltered, that sailors carried across uncharted seas, the same and yet always individual, always unique, each cat its own being, its own personality, its own irreplaceable presence. The cats who share our lives today, whether purebred show animals or alley rescues, whether pampered house cats or working barn cats, all carry that ancient heritage, all participate in that long relationship, and they carry it forward into whatever future awaits, adapting as they have always adapted, surviving as they have always survived, choosing us again and again across the generations. This is the gift they offer, not just their practical skills, not just their beauty or their comfort, but their very presence, their embodiment of the wild made familiar, the foreign made close, the independent choosing to stay. They teach us, if we are willing to learn, about boundaries and respect, about patience and acceptance, about loving without possessing, about sharing space without demanding surrender. The relationship is not simple, never has been. It contains darkness, the persecution of the Middle Ages, the ecological damage of invasive populations, the millions of unwanted animals dying in shelters. But it also contains profound beauty, profound connection, profound meaning, and it endures, changes, evolves, but endures. Tonight, thinking about these creatures, about their long journey from the wild edges of human settlements to the centers of our homes and hearts, I find myself filled with a kind of quiet wonder at the strangeness of it, the improbability, the grace that two species so different could find their way to each other, could build something lasting across millennia, could create a bond that neither dominates nor submits, but simply is. This seems almost miraculous, almost beyond explanation. And yet here we are, here they are, cats in houses all over the world, curled in favorite spots, hunting dust motes in shafts of light, purring in laps, living their mysterious cat lives in the intimate proximity of human lives, neither fully wild nor fully tame, neither servant nor master, simply companion, simply present, simply here. The night is deep now, the house is quiet, somewhere a cat is sleeping, dreaming perhaps of ancient hunts, ancient territories, ancient choices, the same dreams its ancestors dreamed 10,000 years ago, the same essential catness, unchanged, enduring, eternal in its particular way. And in the morning, the cat will wake, will stretch with that perfect feline extension, We'll walk to its bowl or to the door. We'll move through its territory with that characteristic grace. We'll live another day of the long story, the endless story, the story that began in grain stores beside rivers we can barely imagine, and continues here, now, in this moment, in this quiet. The partnership holds 10,000 years and counting. The grain needs protecting, the mice need catching, the hearth needs warming, and the cat, wild and domestic, independent and affectionate, mysterious and familiar, continues its work, continues its presence, continues its choice to stay, to remain, to be with us, but never quite of us, forever itself, forever cat, forever walking that line between two worlds, perfectly balanced, perfectly adapted, perfectly, imperfectly, beautifully, here. And so the story rests for now. In this stillness, in this quiet appreciation of the long arc of connection, the domestication that was never quite domestication, the wildness that was never quite wild, the relationship that defies easy categorization, that refuses simple explanation, that simply is and has been and continues to be. The cats are sleeping, the world turns, the ancient compact holds, and in the space between human and feline, between wild and tame, between choice and necessity, something rare persists, something precious, something worth celebrating in the deep hours when thought drifts soft and wonder settles gentle, like a cat finding its place and curling, quiet, into rest.